Chapter 387. This was a difficult question to answer. Whether the answer was yes or no, it didn't sound good. As such, Jingju didn't pay any attention to the bluebird. The bluebird rolled his eyeballs before asking, even if you drive that stupid child out of the illusionary realm, he can still tell someone else, like Baizhenren. Jingju said, as long as these participants in the Tao competition in the illusionary realm don't know my idea, it's fine. The bluebird said, but I can tell them your idea. You won't, said Jingju. The bluebird felt frustrated, asking, how could you guess my choice? Jingju said, it's because I know what you want. The bluebird fell silent for a long time before saying, I can't help you with that matter. When they played chess in the pavilion in the snow, she had said that she was the spirit of the green sky mirror, but not the rule. Jingju understood what she meant, saying, I'll do it myself. The bluebird said, it's obviously impossible, why do you look so confident? Jingju said, maybe it's because I have more experience in this aspect. What should I do next? Asked the bluebird. Jingju said, as I said, more and more people will know the secret of heaven. You should go and have a look at them. The snowy palace, the blood, and the corpses. Seeing the scene in the sky, the cultivation practitioners outside the Huin Valley were in an uproar, and then fell silent for a long time. Sensei and the young woman Shuei Nunnery eyed each other and saw the shock in each other's eyes, but they didn't say anything. Tong Yen had died just like that. The Aoyama sect's attack was indeed swift and decisive. Yet, many people were puzzled. In their eyes, the Aoyama sect's attack didn't come at the right time and the result. Tong Yen is dead, but the Qin Kingdom's cavalry is still here. Jing of Silla will rebel. Bai Qianjuan's situation is suddenly very favorable. On the side of the Aoyama sect, the disciple of the No Mercy sect was killed, and Zhuoruzhui was severely wounded with a severed arm. Chu Kingdom would be greatly affected, losing the possibility of contending for hegemony with Qin state and Zhao state. Jingju's action was extremely unwise. Why did he do it? In the deep part of the Huin Valley, the sunlight streamed down from the top of the cave, illuminating the slowly rotating green sky mirror. The puppets on the mirror were vivid and lifelike, as if they were coming to life, displaying scenes of joys and sorrows. Tong Yen sat on the cattail hassock and looked at the human world in silence. No one knew what she was thinking. The disciple of the No Mercy sect opened his eyes and woke up. Tong Yen looked over. The two of them separated again after exchanging glances. As the young girl Shuei Nunnery had said to Sensei, the participants of the Tao competition couldn't bring the grudges in the illusionary realm back to the real world. As for what they would think in their minds, nobody knew. Tong Yen had already guessed the identity of this disciple of the No Mercy sect, but he was more alarmed than surprised. Even Lu Shisui had been released from the sword jail. It was evident that the Aoyama sect was well prepared for this Tao competition, and they were determined to win the fairy book of longevity. Thinking of the fairy book that could enchant all the cultivation practitioners and Jingju's methods, Tong Yen furrowed his eyebrows deeply, but his frown was still very faint, like a willow leaf blown by the wind. He placed his hands by his side and was about to push the wheelchair to leave. As soon as he touched the ground, he realized that he had returned to the real world, and this place was neither Tsangzhou nor the capital of Chu Kingdom. Many participants of the Tao competition by the green sky mirror had woken up earlier. Seeing this scene, they couldn't help but let out a smile, thinking that Tong Yen, who had come to the center sect, had the same fate as them. Lu Shisui had already remembered everything by now. Staring at the back of Tong Yen as he left, he thought that his young master must have concealed something significant, and that he should find a way to stall this person. Tong Yen returned to the small building along the passageway. He didn't go to the outside of the Huin Valley after coming out of the building. Instead, he employed the magic method and leapt up in the air. The escape method of heaven and earth was marvelous. In a few minutes, He had already broken through the clouds and arrived on the top of a very high peak on the Cloud Dream Mountain. There was a wooden railing by the cliff's edge. The woman in white stood by the railing. Looking at the snowy mountain in the distance, she turned herself into a snowy mountain as well. Tong Yen landed on the peak top and said with a bow, "This disciple greets my master." Normally, as a swordsman in the Desheng state, she shouldn't care too much about the Dao competition, but it seemed that Bai Jinren had been watching the competition for more than 20 days. "What does Jing Ju intend to do instead of being an emperor?" she asked. Tong Yen said, "He doesn't intend to participate in the competition for the hegemony of the world. He wants to kill all the participants of the Dao competition." "All by himself?" Bai Jinren turned around. Her face seemed to be shrouded by a thin layer of fog, so her countenance couldn't be seen clearly, but a deep cold intent could be vaguely sensed. After some thought, Tong Yen was certain that her judgment was correct, and said, "Yes." Bai Jinren said, "An assassin like Zhuoruzhui has no choice but to die. How can he be different?" The illusionary realm of the green sky mirror had an upper limit. The cultivation practitioners could only reach the initial state of the Yuanying or the free travel. No matter how powerful they were, they couldn't resist the power of a state. After a moment of silence, Tong Yen said, "He should be preparing to break through the upper limit." The reason Jing Jiu expelled him from the illusionary realm was because he didn't want him to tell Bai Qianjun and other participants of the Dao competition about this speculation. If other participants of the Dao competition learned of Jing Jiu's idea and thought it was possible, they would launch an attack on the Chu kingdom in advance, hoping to kill him before he succeeded. "Where did this crazy idea come from?" asked Bai Jinren. Tong Yen said, "Duke Missouri had the opportunity to break through the heavenly tribulation once. I think it was this event that inspired him." "Is he going to ascend even in the illusionary realm?" Bai Jinren let out a mocking smile. Tong Yen understood why her master disdained Jing Jiu's idea. The green sky mirror was a true heavenly treasure, and it was protected by the fairy energy. The spiritual souls of the participants in the Dao competition had no way to break through the forbidding formation. The same thing had happened to Duke Missouri in the past, but they were all killed by the will of the fairy masters. As such, Jing Jiu had no choice but to face the same fate. Tong Yen didn't say anything more. Jing Jiu's idea was indeed preposterous. Even if the other participants of the Dao competition knew his idea, they wouldn't believe it. But, if it were merely a preposterous idea, why would Jing Jiu do so many things and pay such a high price to expel her from the illusionary realm? Thinking of this, Tong Yen suddenly felt the wind on the peak top grew colder than before. For the people living in the royal palace, the cold palace was the coldest place. But Jing Jiu didn't think so, because he didn't feel anything. It was probably because he was still living in the Grand Hall. The rules were still the same, and the curtains were warm and bright, but the palace gate was sealed, and the eunuchs and servant girls weren't allowed to talk to him. One morning, the blue bird landed in front of the window and chirped twice. Jing Jiu finished meditating and opened his eyes. The blue bird strolled to the front of Jing Jiu from the bed, and said while lifting his head to look at Jing Jiu's face, "The decree of self-condemnation you have written is marvelous. I almost thought you were an idiotic and incapable emperor." "The grand scholar's writing is pretty good," said Jing Jiu. By now the blue bird realized that the decree of self-condemnation had been written by someone else. He spread his right wing to cover his head, and said helplessly, "Can you be any lazier?" Jing Jiu uttered The blue bird thought it was the most boring thing in the world to chat with Jing Jiu. "You won't be able to guess where I saw this decree of self-condemnation," he said with great effort. Jing Jiu thought that it should be on the city walls of the capital and all the counties, but how would he know where he saw it? The blue bird said, "It was in the royal palace of Zhao Zhao." "What were you doing there?" asked Jing Jiu. The blue bird said, "I went to look around as you said, but I didn't expect to actually see a person." Jingju looked at her in silence, saying nothing. Chapter 388. According to Jingju's suggestion, the blue bird wandered around this world in search of those who might be able to see through the secrets of heaven. In the end, she went to Zhao's imperial palace. She didn't like going to Zhao's imperial palace because it was filled with the smell of medicine and darkness, which was completely different from the image of Zhao in the mainland. Moreover, she disliked that eunuch very much. The blue bird landed on the corner of the eaves, looking like an animal on the eaves in the twilight. He-Zhan glanced at her imperceptibly and then withdrew his gaze, continuing to read the edict of self-condemnation of Emperor Chu in his hand. His eyebrows were very thin and his face was a bit pale. The longer his gaze stayed on the edict, the higher his eyebrows were raised, and the more gloomy his expression became. Having stayed in the illusionary realm for too long, he had forgotten many things, and there were still many things that he couldn't forget, such as the pain in his childhood, the annoying blue bird that occasionally appeared, and the identities of some people. He knew that Emperor Chu was like him, and he was even more clear that Crown Prince Jing should be his friend. However, it was probably because of the word friend that he had never contacted Sangzhou directly. The death of Crown Prince Jing didn't make him feel sad. On the contrary, the edict of self-condemnation made him feel aggrieved and angry on behalf of Emperor Chu, and he felt that life was really boring. Living was really a dull and uninteresting thing. He-Zhan left the imperial study and came to the front of a palace, taking the medicine handed to him by a palace maid. This medicine was made by himself. The pharmacy was under the strictest supervision, and no one could poison it. Feeling the warmth from the bottom of the bowl, he nodded satisfactorily, pushed open the door, and walked in. He said to the young man in bright yellow behind the desk, "Your Majesty, it's time to take the medicine." Emperor Zhao looked at him and smiled. Then, he started coughing painfully. His face was very pale. Standing next to He-Zhan, they looked like twin brothers. However, He-Zhan's paleness came from the rare sunlight, while the Emperor's paleness came from his illness. Zhao Huang took the bowl of medicine and drank it in one gulp. He also took the wax-gourd candy that He-Zhan took out from the box and put it in his mouth. His complexion and spirit were much better. He-Zhan advised, "There's no need to push yourself so hard. There's no harm in resting for a while." Zhao Huang walked to the wall and pulled the curtain aside. He pointed at the map of the continent and said, "There are still so many places waiting for us. How can we not be anxious?" His father was bound to become one of the most famous incompetent rulers in history, and in contrast, he was bound to become one of the most famous wise rulers in history. Under his rule, Zhao showed a flourishing attitude and gradually revealed its edge. All the dark side returned to Elder He, so his image was incomparably bright, and he won the hearts of the people. He-Zhan thought of the previous self-incriminating edict, and said indifferently, "At least we don't have to worry about the Chu kingdom anymore." Zhao Huang said, "Jing of Silla doesn't have enough courage and is afraid of Mr. Xiaoyue's ability. He won't dare to rebel and will only take Sangzhou to another place." He-Zhan said, "I haven't had much contact with Sangzhou in recent years, so it's hard to win it over. But even if he wants to go to Xianying, I'll find a way to cut more of his flesh. That's the general plan. You and the military can decide how to carry it out, but..." Zhao Huang glanced at him and said, "You don't have to be as ruthless as you were in the past and ruin your reputation. It won't do you any good." He-Zhan said calmly, "I like to make people afraid. It's convenient to get things done this way." Zhao Huang shook his head and pointed at another place on the map, saying, "The canal in Ji County is almost ready. You can leave the task of building the high dam to someone else." Looking at that place, He-Zhan thought back to many years ago. At that time, he was still a little eunuch in concubine Ping's palace, and His Majesty was still the crown prince who could be sentenced to death at any time. They talked about many things by the lake in the imperial garden, such as how to get out of the current situation and what they would do if they succeeded. The canal in Ji County was one of their topics. This canal was very important to Zhao. Once it was repaired, it could irrigate thousands of acres of fertile land. At the same time, it would become a sharp sword hanging over the head of the Qi kingdom. In order to repair this canal, Zhao spent a great deal of resources and energy. He was even forced to slow down the process of digesting Luo. Now it seemed that it was all worth it. If the high dam were to be used in the future, it would be harmful to the harmony of the world. The person in charge of it would definitely be infamous. Therefore, Zhao Huang didn't want He Zhan to take over personally. He Zhan didn't refuse His Majesty's kindness this time. He said, "I'll choose a suitable person. The people of Qi will definitely find a way to make trouble, and then I'll kill another group." The emperor smiled helplessly and said, "Can you stop thinking about killing people all day long?" As the dusk deepened, the shadows from the windows faded, and the light in the hall became red and warm. The emperor and He Zhan's voices became softer and softer. The eunuchs and palace maids watched this scene from outside the hall with smiles on their faces. The people in the palace were already used to seeing such a scene of the emperor and his official discussing the state affairs together. It was a pity that he was a eunuch with a terrible reputation. Otherwise, he would have become a legend in history. As night fell, lights were lit in the palace. The emperor was a little tired. He coughed a few times and sat down on the bed with He Zhan's help. He Zhan said again, "Take care of yourself." The emperor placed his left hand on his knee and waved his right hand. "You know that I don't have many years to live. How can I not be anxious?" If it were any other official, he would have burst into tears and said that His Majesty was in the prime of his life. He Zhan didn't do that. He only looked at the emperor in silence. The emperor lowered his head, looking a little tired. He Zhan looked at the top of the emperor's head. The three swirls clearly represented intelligence. The emperor had always been a very intelligent person. "I want to do something for the people of Zhao State and for the people of the world. If I can't do it in time," the emperor still lowered his head and said, "Help me finish these things." Even if the emperor didn't ask him to do so, He Zhan would do it anyway because it was what he wanted to do. He endured the humiliation and pain and walked in the darkness without seeing the sun just to conquer all the countries, become the ruler of the world, and finally win the throne. He was silent for a long time and suddenly asked, "Are these last words or entrusting an orphan?" The difference between last words and entrusting an orphan was the word orphan. It became very quiet in the hall. The eunuchs and palace maids had already left. The emperor slowly raised his head and looked at him. "You still don't support my decision? Just a few days ago, something big happened in Zhao State. The emperor was weak and had no children, so he decided to choose a nephew from the royal family to be his adopted son. Finally, after several selections, the emperor chose the clever and honest boy from the prince of Hejian County. I have always opposed this decision," He Zhan calmly said. "He is a wolf cub who can't be raised well. It was related to the succession of the throne, so a eunuch had no right to comment, let alone speak so rudely and impudently." The emperor didn't get angry. After a moment of silence he said, "This is the only way. Help me keep an eye on him." He Zhan said, "Okay." Yet the emperor grew angry because he knew He Zhan was lying. He Zhan had made his attitude very clear when he asked if these were last words or entrusting an orphan. "I know that you won't treat that child like you treat me after I die." The emperor stared into He Zhan's eyes and said, "Because you have always wanted to be a real emperor." He Zhan was silent for a while and said, "It's actually not wrong to say so. There were many rumors about this matter in the court and even in foreign countries. The emperor didn't ask about it, and He Zhan didn't say anything until tonight." The emperor's face grew even paler, and flames of anger danced in his eyes as if he were looking at a traitorous villain. He was infuriated by the look in his eyes and said, "Without me, could you become emperor? Without me, you would have died countless times." The emperor said in a low voice, "But this is what you should do." He said with slight mockery, "Why? Because you are the emperor and I am a subject?" The emperor was silent for a while and said, "No, because we are friends." He said, "I have forgotten many things, but I always remember that the word friend is not to be trusted. Hearing it makes me feel disgusted." The emperor was silent for a long time and suddenly said, "Did you do something to the chestnut tree on the slope in the imperial garden?" He frowned slightly and said, "How did you know?" The emperor said, "You had not completed your martial arts at the time, so it was inevitable that some traces would be left." He said, "Back then, you also investigated me and knew that I had a relationship with the old eunuch Hong, so you became acquainted with me. To put it bluntly, you were also using me." The emperor said with some disappointment, "Yes, from the very beginning, we were using each other." He said nothing. The emperor suddenly coughed, appearing to be in great pain. He frowned slightly and took out a medicinal pill. After thinking for a long time, he cut off a quarter of it and fed it to the emperor, then helped him lie down. The emperor's coughing gradually stopped and he calmed down, closing his eyes to rest. He took his leave and prepared to leave. The emperor suddenly called out to him and looked at his back, asking, "You are not a person of this world?" He's body was somewhat stiff as he said, "What nonsense are you talking about?" The emperor withdrew his gaze and looked at the starry sky outside the window. "In the past, I did not think that this world was fake. It was not until I discovered that you had no feelings for this world that I began to think about this problem." He said, "I don't understand what you mean." The emperor said, "To this world, you are like an eternal guest. To you, I seem to be an eternal stranger. This is what I mean." He lowered his head and thought for a while, then said, "I will serve you to the end. I won't do anything, and I will also ensure the Empress's good fortune for the rest of her life." Having said this, he walked out of the palace hall. From beginning to end, he did not turn around or look back. "If you were not a eunuch, what would it matter if I gave the throne to you?" The emperor's voice came from behind him. Walking out of the palace hall, a eunuch helped him put on a large cloak. It was unavoidably cold in the depths of the night. Dozens of eunuchs clustered around him as he walked out of the royal palace. These eunuchs were all Hejan's subordinates and possessed terrifying battle prowess. Under these circumstances, it would be very difficult to kill Hejan. Seeing that the palace gate was right in front of him, Hejan suddenly stopped and said, "I'm going to take a look somewhere. Wait for me here." Hearing this, the eunuchs were alarmed. They thought that there were countless heroes and warriors in the world who wanted to kill Elder He. Even the royal palace was not safe. What was the eunuch planning to do? Hejan came to the imperial garden. He stood under the chestnut tree, silently gazing into the distance. The starlight shone on his black cloak. He looked at it like a demon of nostalgia. Chapter 389. Yesterday I wrote "een as Wu." What does that mean? It means that I used 5 strokes instead of pinyin. I rarely make such a low-level mistake now. Does it mean that I'm more cultured? No, it just means that I use fewer and fewer complicated words in my book. Is this laziness? Of course not. It means that I've become more self-aware and my taste has improved. Today is the first anniversary of the opening of De Dao. To summarize, I'm very satisfied. Thank you. Hejan walked out of the imperial palace and walked on the street with the eunuch. Pedestrians gave way to him. There were fewer and fewer people on the street because there was a gloomy yamen at the end of the long street. This was the intelligence bureau founded by Hejan. It was under the direct control of His Majesty. In most cases, this was his yamen. There were thousands of spies in the intelligence bureau and even more red-armored cavalrymen. Most of the high-level officials were eunuchs promoted by He-Zhan. They could directly supervise and arrest ministers and even nobles without the approval of the Ministry of Justice. They had great power. The eunuchs and officials were dressed in low-key black clothes. The powerful red-armored cavalrymen were dressed in embroidered clothes. They were dazzling even in the dark night. As He-Zhan walked into the yamen, the eunuchs and red-armored cavalrymen bowed to him. He walked to the highest place expressionlessly, took off his big robe and threw it to his subordinate. Then he sat down in a chair. All of them knelt down and said in unison, "Greetings, Your Excellency." He-Zhan was still expressionless. He raised his finger slightly and signaled them to stand up. Then he supported his chin with his right hand and closed his eyes to rest. The subordinates knew their Excellency's habit. They stepped forward to report the recent situation as usual. The students of the Wansong Academy complained a lot. They even secretly contacted the Confucian scholars of the Qi Kingdom. They wanted to do something disgraceful. 13 of the leaders have been imprisoned. The official paused and continued, but the news leaked too fast. The students of the academy have gathered. If we suppress it by force, I'm afraid it will cause. He-Zhan closed his eyes and said, "You can't kill the scholar. Killing him would be what they want. As for how to deal with him, do you want me to teach you?" His tone was very calm, but the official was instantly drenched in cold sweat. In a trembling voice he said, "The factory is making preparations, but it will take some time to prepare those letters. We will accuse the leaders of colluding with Qin, and then some righteous people will break into their homes, or set them on fire, or kill them." He-Zhan was somewhat dissatisfied and said, "It's still too rough. Be more meticulous." The official wiped the sweat off his brow and retreated. Another official stepped forward to report, "The Qi merchants have been slow to react to the Tao Mountain Canal incident, but the He and Xiao families are obviously on high alert. They are sending large amounts of money into the capital in an attempt to bribe the high-ranking officials of the court." He-Zhan opened his eyes and slowly scanned the faces of his subordinate. If Qi Shang wanted to bribe the courtiers, these eunuchs from the intelligence bureau would be the main targets. They would have been fattened by now. No one dared to raise their heads and look He-Zhan in the eyes. The official who reported suppressed the fear in his heart and said with a pale face, "Your Excellency, please give us your orders. We won't touch the Tao Mountain Canal, so you can take as much money as you want from the Qi merchants." He-Zhan said expressionlessly, "But they have to send me what I want as soon as possible. I'll give them as much money as they want. But if they still refuse to send me the information about the treasure ship, then release the news that the sea merchants of the Qi Kingdom humiliated our ambassador, and then let Orchid Island go ashore." The officials of the Intelligence Bureau felt the air in the yamen became colder. The merchants of the Qi Kingdom could be bribed, and they could also be deterred by killing. Everyone knew that the little elder, he was not a patient person. If he failed to bribe them once, he would kill them. But today, it was obvious that his killing intent was especially strong. The sea merchants of the Qi Kingdom humiliated the ambassador of Zhao State's ambassador, but Orchid Island was a real killer. Both the Qi Kingdom and Zhao State, and even the officials of the Intelligence Bureau, were guessing that this famous pirate was a fierce dog raised by the little elder He. As for why the eunuch was so concerned about the information about the treasure ship, no one could figure it out. The third official began his report. Censor Chen still refuses to admit it. Then continue the interrogation. Interrogate him carefully and carefully. Don't let him die, and don't let him live too comfortably. He-Zhan thought of the stubborn censor, and a mocking smile appeared on his face, but no one knew who it was meant for. Speaking of which, if the imperial court is full of these fatherless, widowed officials, how can we work for His Majesty? The official plucked up his courage and asked, "If he confesses about the West Huai, how should we interrogate him next?" The West Huai was a scenic spot in the Hejian prefecture. He-Zhan lifted his eyelids and glanced at the official, asking, "What benefits did He-Jian send you?" The official said with a bitter smile, "If I had received benefits, I wouldn't have dared to ask this question. But it's a prince's mansion after all." Hearing this, the officials in the Intelligence Bureau changed their expressions slightly, feeling that this was a bit difficult. If it were an ordinary prince's mansion, the Intelligence Bureau could easily investigate it. Currently, there were 2 commandery princes and 3 imperial uncles in the imperial prison. Who would be afraid of them? But the one in the prince's mansion of He-Jian was the future emperor. He-Zhan looked at his subordinates in silence, saying, "I only have eyes for His Majesty, and no one else. Do you understand?" Hearing this, the officials all knelt on the ground, not daring to say a word. In the imperial palace of the Chu kingdom, in the coldest palace hall, the starlight became even colder. The blue bird strolled to the front of Jingjiu. Thinking of the scenes he had seen in the capital of the state of Zhao, he said fearfully, "That eunuch is truly abnormal and dreadful." "Tell me about Zhao Huang," said Jingjiu. The blue bird came back to his senses and said, "The relationship between He-Zhan and Zhao Huang is indeed complicated and subtle, but how can Zhao Huang see through the reality of the world? I can't understand it." In the green sky mirror, some people had reached a very high cultivation state, but they were eventually wiped out by the heavenly punishment. But the situation for Duke Missouri and Zhao Huang was different. The 2 of them had realized clearly, or in other words, they had sensed that the world they were in was not real. The illusionary realm was not the real world, and the world they sought was not the real world, so the people in the world were not the real beings. However, if someone realized the unreality of the world, it meant that they had seen the reality and become the reality. She had lived in the green sky mirror for tens of thousands of years, but she had never seen anything like this. "Like I said, you have to start with yourself," Jingjiu continued while looking at the blue bird. "You have to know who you are first." The blue bird walked to the edge of the teacup and looked at the surface of the water, where she saw the reflection of a bird. A gust of wind rose, creating ripples on the surface of the teacup, blurring the reflection of the bird. She had turned into an icy little girl, her transparent wings flapping slightly, bringing up a fresh and clean wind, exuding a faint fairy intent in all directions. Though the people in the imperial palace couldn't sense it, the trees outside the window and the birds in their nests could sense it. Qing'er looked at the teacup again, and then lifted her head to look at Jingjiu, saying confusedly, "I am me." Jingjiu said, "When I saw you in the small building for the first time, I was certain that you were the true spirit of the heavenly state, but I was still a bit lacking." Feeling baffled, Qing'er asked, "What's the difference?" Jingjiu dipped his finger in the teacup and smeared it between her eyebrows, saying, "Though you don't know it yourself, it's not a bit lacking now." Qing'er felt a cool sensation between her eyebrows as she recalled that scene again. It was the same peak top, and the snowy mountains outside and inside the railing. She had lied to Baizhenren. It was not a big lie, it was merely a harmless lie. Yet, it was the first time she had lied. Yes, from that moment on, I had become a complete true spirit of the heavenly state. Looking at Jingjiu, Qing'er asked inquisitively, "But what does it have to do with what has happened in the green sky mirror?" Jingjiu said, "The true spirit of the heavenly state has its own cultivation state. It is born with the world in it." Qing'er was startled. "Is it true?" she asked while covering her mouth with her small hand. "How did you know?" Those true spirits of the heavenly state in the ancient times had ascended with the immortals in the ancient times, or they had perished over time. It had been many years since the true spirit of the heavenly state had appeared. Nobody knew what the true spirit of the heavenly state meant. The sect master of the Zhongzhou school didn't know, neither did Baizhenren, and even Qing'er herself. But Jingjiu knew it. "I've seen a true spirit of the heavenly state before. You are the second one." Jingjiu continued, "Once you become a true spirit of the heavenly state, you will enter the hidden world state. Qing exclaimed incredulously, as I remember, your hidden world state is above the Mahayana state. Does it mean that I'm a fairy lady now? You can think of it that way, said Jingjiu. Qing exclaimed with widened eyes. It's because I've become a fairy lady that the people in the green sky mirror have woken up? Jingjiu said, the hidden world is the real world, not the illusionary realm. As such, the people in the green sky mirror will become real people. It took Qing a long time to understand what Jingjiu meant. So I'm the master of this world? She asked uncertainly. Jingjiu said, you can understand it that way. But your situation is quite different from the hidden world I've seen. Our world is a patch of empty space, but your world is a world that has existed for tens of thousands of years. According to my calculation, when the world in the green sky mirror is destroyed, you will disappear along with it. So it's more like a symbiotic relationship. Qing said with an intoxicated expression while holding her small fists, I suddenly feel that I'm a great person, no, a grand person. You've thought too much, said Jingjiu. Qing didn't want to pay attention to him. What should I do next? She asked. Wait. Jingjiu said, we can't let anybody else know about it. There hasn't been a fairy lady like me in Chaotian for many years, Qing said proudly. What should I be afraid of except that monster in the north? Jingjiu said, the cultivation state doesn't represent the fighting prowess. You said it yourself that you're merely the mirror spirit, not the ruler. Moreover, the fairy book is here. Qing understood what Jingjiu meant, feeling a bit frustrated. She suddenly thought of something and asked, what is the true spirit of the heavenly state that you've seen before? It's a mushroom, replied Jingjiu. What? Exclaimed Qing with widened eyes. Sometimes it's a blade of grass, sometimes it's a rock, and sometimes it's even a monkey. Chapter 390. Qing didn't understand what Jingjiu meant. She thought about it carefully, but still couldn't figure it out. As such, she gave up and asked, aren't you worried about the Qin kingdom and Zhao? Bai Qianjun and that damned eunuch are truly formidable, not to mention that little Zhao is still in the illusionary realm. The affairs of others have nothing to do with me, said Jingjiu. Qing recalled the scene on this bed more than 10 years ago. She really likes you, she said with a sigh. I thought there would be many stories between the two of you, but I didn't expect you to be so heartless, she sighed. It's all fake, said Jingjiu. Qing said with widened eyes, but you said that this world is becoming real. Jingjiu said, for any world, those who are destined to leave this world are all fake. This statement had a deeper meaning. It was evident that it referred not only to the world in the green sky mirror, but also to the real world outside. Qing stared at him for a long time and suddenly asked, what are you doing in this world then? I want the fairy book, said Jingjiu. Every participant in the Tao competition who entered the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror aimed at the fairy book of longevity. This was a crude answer, but it could also be said to be simple and straightforward. Qing asked him earnestly, are you sure you can succeed? I can't help you under the circumstances. Jingjiu said, I've chosen a different method and a different path. We'll know who is right in the end. When people recalled the past events and tried to sort out their memories, they would often choose some important events as the time point. The sad thing was that those important events were usually not happy events, but funerals. For instance, a senior member of the family closed his eyes while sitting on the bamboo chair, or many white banners were blown down by the wind at the funeral of a relative. As far as the populace was concerned, the funerals were of a higher standard, and the dead had to be heavy enough to leave a deep impression on their collective memory, which would become a spiritual record for them. For instance, the death of an emperor. As far as this event was concerned, it was hard to distinguish between a funeral and a happy event, because the death of the old emperor meant the ascension of a new emperor. In the palace of the Qin kingdom, The old man on the sickbed had a face full of wrinkles. His white hair was as dry as the frost grass in late autumn. His eyes were sunken and his breathing was weak. It seemed that he was going to die soon. Crown Prince Baizhou, who was also known as Bai Qianjun, did not show any signs of sorrow, because he would be the new king of the Qin kingdom, and also because he didn't have much affection for this old man. Even if more than 20 years had worn away a lot of memories, at least he remembered clearly that this old man was not his real biological father. The dying emperor was originally just a member of a remote royal family. Relying on his innate ability to deal with people and an occasional burst of passion, he went to Beihai County to attack the commandery prince and even got the real position of the governor. During the confrontation with the northern barbarians for decades, he concealed his cowardice better and better. He also accumulated a profound strength and finally became the new emperor of the Qin kingdom by the trend of the world. This period of history could be called a resurgence or even the founding of the country. The old emperor should have been written more vividly in the history books, but unfortunately, he gave birth to an even more brilliant son. The young martial god of the past had now become the god of massacre of the northern kingdom, who could stop children from crying at night. Even in the palace of the Qin kingdom, no one dared to look him in the eyes. I don't like being called a god, because I know I'm not one. I also don't like being called Taizong or Taizong, because I think that neither you nor the previous emperors are qualified to be ranked before me. So I've decided to call myself White Emperor after my ascension. What do you think of the name White Emperor? Bai Qianjun said, "The coronation ceremony is ready, so you should die tonight. Don't waste my time." After saying this, he walked out of the hall. The old emperor stared at his back, his eyes full of resentment and regret. There were countless palaces in the palace of Xianyang. In terms of quantity, only the education palace of the Qi kingdom could be mentioned in the same breath. In the darkness of the night, those palaces looked like countless ferocious beasts crouching, ready to pounce and tear their prey apart. Under the starlight, they looked even more ferocious. Bai Qianjun walked to the deepest palace, waved his hand, and chased everyone away. He followed the sound of the zither and found that person. A pond under the porch reflected the lights of the lanterns. There, a young girl played the zither lightly. Her white dress fluttered in the darkness, like a lotus in the pond. The whole scene gave off a lonely and pitiful feeling, very much in line with the image of a fallen princess being imprisoned in the cold palace. But in fact, her eyes were calm, and there were no unnecessary emotions. "I'm going to be enthroned tomorrow." Bai Qianjun walked up to her and looked down at her, his eyes full of affection and love. "Congratulations, senior brother," Bai Zhao said with a smile, lifting his head. The emotions in Bai Qianjun's eyes had disappeared a long time ago, as he said, "I have received the news from the Qi kingdom." Upon hearing this, the expression on Bai Zhao's face changed a bit. It was evident that she was more concerned about the incident in the Qi kingdom than the death of the Qin emperor and the change of the dynasty. Many of the 20-odd participants who had entered the illusionary realm had died. Those who were still alive had basically been identified. Only the disciple of Yamatsai hadn't shown up yet. The scholar named Shiyun hadn't been discovered since the beginning. He didn't leave any trace in the illusionary realm, as if he had never been there. This was what Tong Yen wanted to know the most. But he didn't know how Shiyun had done it, not until he was killed by Jing Jiu and driven out of the illusionary realm. Bai Zhao was also concerned about this matter. He had asked the spy organization of the Qin kingdom to investigate this matter for many years, and they had finally found some clues in the early spring. His name is Yun Qihir. He used to study under Duke Missouri, and later went to the Academy of Qi Kingdom to take care of the books. He started to give lectures 2 years ago. Bai Qianjun continued, "He hasn't had any contact with the outside world over the last few years. But a disciple he took some time ago had some contact with a scholar from the Wansong Institute of Zhao. Hearing the word give lectures, Bai Zhao had roughly understood what this disciple of Yamatsai intended to do, but he was still puzzled. How did he manage to hide his identity so well? The expression on Bai Qianjuan's face grew complicated as he said, "It's because he doesn't even know who he is." Bai Zhao was taken aback a bit as he asked, "Do you mean that he has completely forgotten his identity?" Bai Qianjun nodded. Feeling startled, Bai Zhao asked, "Are you sure?" Bai Qianjun said, "I've sent 7 groups of people to give it a try. I'm sure that he has indeed forgotten his identity as a participant of the Tao competition, and that all he wants to do is to save the people and achieve the Tao." Looking at the strings on the zither, Bai Zhao remained silent. The participants of the Tao competition might actually forget their past events after living in the illusionary realm for too long and being confused by the mortal world, but it was evident that Shi Yun didn't do that. It was more like he had intentionally forgotten his past event. Why did he do that? After a long while, she remarked sentimentally, "It's truly marvelous." Bai Qianjun had the same opinion, asking, "How should we deal with it? The masters of Yamatsai don't cultivate, but their Tao hearts are as firm as a rock and can't be shaken." Bai Zhao said, "We have to find a way to kill him right now, otherwise, he will be a big trouble in the future." Bai Qianjun suddenly said, "I've also forgotten something. As long as I don't think about it, I will naturally forget it. But there are some things that I can't forget even if I don't want to." Even the most tranquil gaze could be sensed, not to mention the heat hidden behind the tranquility. Bai Zhao didn't raise his head as he asked, "Big Brother Tong Yen has gone out. What do you think?" Bai Qianjun pulled back his gaze slowly and looked at the unreal reflections of the lanterns on the pond, his voice a bit cold. "I opposed him going to the capital of the Chu kingdom in the first place. Young sister, you and he both attach too much importance to Jingjiu." Bai Zhao said lightly, "Big brother is dead, which proves that Jingjiu is worthy of our attention as I said." After a moment of silence, Bai Qianjun said, "Young sister, you are always right." Looking at his profile in silence, Bai Zhao said, "Yes. Is there anything wrong?" "There is nothing wrong. Everything is going according to your and Tong Yan's plan, and the fairy book will fall into our hands in the end." A gust of night wind passed through the palace, shattering the reflections of the lanterns as far as the eye could see. Looking in that direction in silence, Bai Qianjun said, "I just want to forget some more things all of a sudden." Having said this, he turned around and walked out of the hall to prepare for the coronation ceremony the next day. Looking at the surface of the water, Bai Zhao said nothing. She understood what he meant, but she found it boring. The broken reflections of the lanterns on the surface of the pond slowly gathered together. She thought of the news from the Chu kingdom. After issuing the edict of self-condemnation, Jingjiu was put under house arrest by that grand scholar in the cold palace. The edict of self-condemnation was certainly not written by him, and it was of his own accord that he was put under house arrest in the cold palace, just like Zhao Liu. Thinking of these coincidences, Bai Zhao smiled, feeling it was quite interesting. Another 5 years passed. The White Emperor of the Qin Kingdom was tyrannical, imposing taxes and imposing exorbitant taxes. He forced 3,000 wealthy families in Luoxi to move to Xianyang. Complaints were heard everywhere, but they were immediately suppressed. Under his personal command, 30,000 cavalrymen swept across the north of the continent like the sharpest sword. They were invincible, and even the barbaric tribes retreated in fear. The only country that could compete with the Qin kingdom, Zhao encountered a major event at this time. Their emperor was about to die. This emperor was extremely wise, and he was a master of both leniency and severity. Unfortunately, he was born with a weak body and had no children. In the past 5 years, probably because of these problems, the court and the people of Zhao had been permeated with a strange atmosphere. The emperor issued a series of edicts, appointing and dismissing people, restricting the power of the intelligence bureau, and supporting his supporters. It was obvious that he was going to take action against Elder He. However, no matter how much the officials and people of Zhao State and even the merchants of Qi State waited, the emperor didn't do anything to Master Eunuch He in the end. He even trusted Master Eunuch He and only drank the medicine brewed by Master Eunuch He. The smell of medicine in the hall was much lighter than in previous years, probably because the windows were open and ventilation was good. Grand Secretary Zhang is 50 years older than us. No matter how hard he tries, he won't be able to last until 20 years later. The emperor's pale face did not improve after drinking the medicine. He leaned on the bed and panted. From now on, you are the only one who can deal with the White Emperor. He Zhan did not say anything, nor did he advise the emperor to take a good rest. Everyone knew that the emperor could not hold on for more than a few days. Facing the emperor's expectant and pleading eyes, He Zhan remained silent for a while. He patted the back of the emperor's hand and still did not say anything. A wind came in from outside the palace, followed by the empress. She walked to the bed with tears on her face and pushed He Zhan away roughly. She sat beside the emperor and held his hand. He Zhan walked out of the hall and faintly heard a faint sigh behind him. That very night the emperor of Zhao died. He Zhan watched him die with his own eyes. Then he calmly began to arrange all kinds of affairs. When he was almost done, he went back to his room to sleep for an hour. During the whole process, he did not do anything out of line or disrespectful. The empress asked someone to ask him. After knowing that he did not go to the imperial garden, she remained silent for a long time. She did not know whether she should be happy or disappointed. Before dawn, the imperial palace was filled with officials in plain clothes. Many of them went out of the city to welcome the emperor according to the rules. The crown prince of King Hejian was going to the capital to inherit the throne. Normally, it had been decided 5 years ago. The crown prince should have been raised in the imperial palace as a crown prince and directly inherited the throne today. But for some reason, the proposal was not approved. It was said that Elder He did not like the crown prince and secretly did something. Time passed slowly. The morning light gradually illuminated the eaves of the palace. However, the officials who went out of the city to welcome the emperor had not returned yet. The atmosphere inside and outside the imperial palace was a bit tense. What on earth happened? The sound of hooves came from the long street. Horses reported quickly. Then it was reported. The officials and nobles on both sides of the jade stairs in front of the hall stared at the official of the Ministry of Rights as if they wanted to eat him alive. The official of the Ministry of Rights said nervously with a pale face, "The Crown Prince." The Crown Prince? No. He refused to go through the Jingming Gate. He wanted to go through the Xihua Gate. Hearing this, the front of the hall suddenly became silent. The officials looked at each other and did not know what to do. The Crown Prince ascended the throne through the Jingming Gate. The Emperor returned to the palace through the Xihua Gate. It was simple but very important. At every important historical moment, there was always a shortage of officials in the imperial court who were brave enough to take charge. Soon, the silence in front of the hall was broken. A Hanlin Academy official stood out and began to quote the classics to prove the correctness of the emperor's decision to go through the Xihua Gate. Then, several other officials agreed. Great achievements naturally came with great risk, but the real bigwigs on the scene remained silent. The voices of the officials in the debate gradually lowered. All eyes were fixed on one place. It was not the highest place, and it was even a little far from the jade stairs. It was the shadow of a corner of the hall. A man was standing in the shadow. "If you don't want to go through the Jingming Gate, then please go back." During the whole process of the new emperor's enthronement, He Zhan only said this one sentence. It was recorded in the history books. Chapter 391. Jingming Gate was a side gate of the royal palace. Unlike its name, it was not very bright. It was dark, quiet, and somewhat frightening. The young emperor looked at the dark and long passageway in front of him and thought of the words the palace servant had passed on earlier. His face paled slightly. Given his temperament, he wanted nothing more than to turn and leave at this moment and return to Hejian Manor to be his own heir. But 5 years ago, his mother had told him that if he went to Jingdo, nothing else mattered except for 2 things: to be filial to the empress and not to offend elder He. He didn't understand what was so frightening about that eunuch and why the entire state of Zhao was as silent as a cicada in front of him. He also didn't understand why he had to be subservient to a eunuch if he became emperor. It didn't matter if he didn't understand. His mother used an extreme method to make him remember this matter and never forget it. Not long after she said those words 5 years ago, his mother died of illness. Everyone knew that it was because she had to die. A country could not have 2 masters, and an emperor could not have 2 mothers. Thinking of these things, the youth's face paled even more. He took a deep breath and walked through the palace gate. Seeing this scene, the officials finally relaxed. The history books recorded that during the process of the new emperor's ascension, eunuch He Zhan only said one thing. Of course, this was not true. But no one else could hear what he said other than the young emperor. The light in the side hall of the Wenhua Palace was dim. He Zhan's face was hidden in the shadows. The young emperor became even more nervous and unconsciously looked outside the hall. The old people from Hejian Manor who had followed him into the palace were waiting outside. They had not been driven away or replaced. This fact did not comfort him at all. It only showed that the people in the palace had absolute confidence in controlling him. He Zhan said, "Back then, your majesty should have entered the palace as the crown prince to learn government affairs, but you were stopped. The rumors said it was me, but it was not me." Hearing these words, the little emperor had the misconception that eunuch He was afraid and wanted to express his loyalty to him. His expression became a bit strange. Fortunately, elder He's next words came very quickly, avoiding a misunderstanding. The new emperor only treated it as a one-day farce. "I'm not afraid, nor am I trying to explain. I just want to tell your majesty that I know you were the one who didn't want to enter the palace 5 years ago," He Zhan said, "but in the end it has come to this. I can't not think about it, so I'll just live in the palace." His tone was very calm and unhurried, but the words and attitude in his words made the little emperor feel extreme anger, and then extreme fear. Anger stemmed from helplessness. Naturally, fear grew in one's heart. The little emperor's lips trembled. He wanted to say a few words, but in the end, nothing came out. The people who were secretly sent to the capital by Hejian Prefecture in the past 5 years have been caught in the early hours of this morning. I believe they are all dead by now. He Zhan's tone was still very calm as he said, "Your Majesty will not be harassed by those ill-intentioned rebels in the future." The little emperor's face became abnormally pale. The Hejian Prefecture had made a lot of preparations. In the past 5 years, no one knew how much gold and silver, as well as men of sacrifice and counselors, had been sent to the capital, just to ensure that he could sit firmly on the throne. Who would have thought that all these things had been under the control of the Intelligence Bureau the whole time? It only took one night to wipe them all out. These people I brought into the palace, are they all going to be killed? The little emperor could no longer control his emotions. He stared into He Zhan's eyes and said angrily, "Eunuch, don't you want to save some face for the royal family?" He Zhan said, "Of course not. You should know that from now on, you are the son of the late emperor and the ruler of Zhao State. I will give you full respect." The order of the narration was very important. You have to remember that you are the son of the late emperor and have nothing to do with Hejian Prefecture anymore. If you can't remember this, many more people will die, and you might not even be the new emperor of Zhao State. The little emperor was silent for a long time. Then he asked with frustration and mockery, "How should I address you from now on, eunuch?" He-Jean said, "In private, I allow you to call me uncle." Having said that, he walked toward the outside of the hall of Wenhua. Looking at the back of the dark figure, the little emperor's face was full of shock and absurdity. Eventually, it turned into fear. The Yuan Palace was the bedroom of the empress. Today, the empress had become the Empress Dowager, but she still lived here. The Empress Dowager and the late emperor had a good relationship. Since the Empress Dowager had been supporting the Empress Dowager for 5 years, her relationship with Elder, he was naturally not good. He-Jean walked into the hall. He looked a bit tired. Seeing him like this, the Empress Dowager felt less sorrow and sneered silently. "I have finished talking with His Majesty. It went well," He-Jean said. "As we have discussed before, Your Majesty, you will stay behind the curtain, and I won't show up. You know very well whether it is inconvenient to show up or not." The Empress Dowager said, "A eunuch can't show up in the open after all. I don't understand why you are still holding on. I can kill you with a decree." "Your Majesty, you should call yourself Ijia." He-Jean's expression didn't change. "There is no longer a person like Duke Missouri in the world. The imperial court is in my hands. No one in the world can kill me. Even if they can, Your Majesty, you shouldn't do it." The Empress Dowager slightly raised her chin and proudly said, "Without Ijia, you can't do anything." He-Jean said likewise, "Relying on those idiotic imperial uncles of Your Majesty's, the court will change hands in less than 10 years. Your Majesty, you will be invited to the cold palace, and your family will be slaughtered." The chestnut tree was still in the imperial palace. They were still using each other. The Empress Dowager was silent for a while. "The matter this time will not be settled so easily." Everyone knew the difference between the Jingming school and the Xihua school, and the relationship between the young emperor and Elder He. How could those courageous officials in the court who were good at opportunism miss this opportunity? Led by the censorate, the imperial censorate began to launch a tentative attack. The students of the Imperial College and the scholars of the Wansong Academy reacted even more violently. According to the investigation of the Intelligence Bureau, the shadow of the Qi Kingdom's academy was vaguely behind all these incidents. All the clues pointed to the scholar named Yun Qi. Dozens of days later, the attacks on He-Jean entered a new stage. Neither the chancellors in the court nor the Empress Dowager in the imperial palace showed any reaction, even though they were also the ones being attacked by the scholars. As long as He-Jean personally suppressed the matter, his reputation would become worse and more loopholes would be exposed no matter what the final result was. He-Jean didn't pay attention to this matter, nor did he show up. He waited until the Intelligence Bureau got those things and then entered the Imperial Palace late at night to seek an audience with the Empress Dowager. The Empress Dowager wanted to stall for time by saying that she didn't want to see Elder He since it was late, but how could the palace guard stop him? Looking at He-Jean, who still appeared in front of her, the Empress Dowager tightened her clothes. She was extremely furious and shouted, "What on earth do you want to do?" He-Jean didn't say anything. He placed the files in front of her. The Empress Dowager glanced at them and became even more furious. "Are you trying to frame me?" she demanded. "This is the matter of Your Majesty's family. Your Majesty doesn't know anything about it, and it's not a plot," He-Jean said, "seizing the fertile land by force, forcing the magistrate to commit suicide, and oppressing men and women are all trivial matters, but it's a big deal to unite Qi. If the people knew that Your Majesty's family has been supported by the merchants of the Qi Kingdom all these years, how would they react?" Having said that, he left the royal palace, not even taking the files with him. The Empress Dowager looked at the files in silence for the whole night. She finally made a decision the next morning. She summoned several ministers to the royal palace and issued several edicts. The ministers accepted the edict. The censorate was purged. Those who should be imprisoned were imprisoned, and those who should be exiled were exiled. The Wansong Academy was sealed. The classes of the Imperial College were temporarily suspended because of the reconstruction of the Ming Hall. All these things were thrilling. The most thrilling was, of course, the sound of caning outside the royal palace. Some officials shouldered the burden of Taoist heart, and some were unyielding, but their butts were soft. How could their official robes not be stained red after being caned more than 10 times? The situation gradually calmed down. Though the secret agents of the Intelligence Bureau and the officials in Elder He's faction didn't do anything during the whole process, it still couldn't stop the people from blaming him for the crimes, just like they had done in the past years. Elder He's reputation was even worse. He seemed to have become a real devil. For the naughty children who cried at night, his deterrence was even greater than that of the terrible White Emperor of the Qin Kingdom. The new emperor of the state of Zhao was still young, and the royal dowager presided over the state affairs from behind the curtains. The whole world was aware that Elder He, who stood in the shadows, was the real ruler of the state. People called him 9,000 years. Though there were few chancellors like He Zhan who could control the imperial court and play the emperor in the palm of his hand, they would usually die soon. Few of them could control the state affairs for so many years like He Zhan. In the world of the Green Sky Mirror, He Zhan was not the only one. He had another colleague, who was the Grand Secretary Zhang of the Chu Kingdom, who was called Mr. Shaoyue by the people. The Chu Emperor had been in the Cold Palace for 10 years, and had almost disappeared from the memory of the people. For many children, they only knew the Grand Scholar, but they didn't know the Emperor. The Grand Secretary Zhang was still unparalleled in governing the state affairs, but his temperament became more and more peculiar, and his methods became more and more forceful. Even though nobody dared oppose him, their resentment toward him grew more and more. One evening, after the Grand Scholar had finished reading the memorials to the throne, he felt his vision blurred. He stood up and walked to the window. Looking at the setting sun, he realized something. The previous Qin Emperor had been dead for almost 20 years. The Qin Emperor of Beihai County had been dead for 10 years, and the young Zhao Huang had been dead for 5 years. The Grand Scholar had gone to the royal palace. The news shocked the whole of the capital, and it had even spread to Zhao and the Qin Kingdom. The eunuchs and palace servant girls knelt not far from the grand hall. Seeing the scene in front of them, they felt bewildered, not knowing what to do. The tightly closed palace gate was as mottled as a painting, and the iron lock was rusty. The eaves on the other side of the wall were full of traces of disrepair. Seeing this palace hall that had been abandoned for many years, the Grand Secretary Zhang had a complicated feeling. He tidied his clothes and bowed to the ground slowly. "This official asks for an audience, Your Majesty." A chilly voice came out from the palace hall. As I said, don't disturb me for no reason. For many eunuchs and palace servant girls, this was the first time they had heard the voice of the emperor. Their expressions were complicated. "This official has something to say," said the Grand Secretary Zhang. "What's the matter?" asked the chilly voice. The Grand Secretary Zhang bowed to the palace gate solemnly, saying, "This official is old and dying." Chapter 392. Lanterns were seldom lit in the cold palace, but one was lit today, because it was rare to have a guest. Looking at Grand Secretary Zhang's silver hair, Jingju realized that so many years had passed. "I thought you could live for many more years. With your ability, the rebellion of Jing Silla is a trivial matter, and Qin and Zhao are not a threat. The world will be fine." Jingju said, "I didn't expect this day to come." Grand Secretary Zhang said sentimentally, "I'm 80 years old this year, which is a very old man. If it weren't for the magic pills Your Majesty bestowed upon me every year, I would have become a skeleton a long time ago." Jingju said, "I need you, so you don't have to thank me." Grand Secretary Zhang said earnestly, "Your Majesty dares to use and trust me. It's my greatest fortune in my life." Jingju said, I also think it's a good thing. Grand Secretary Zhang looked at Jingju's face, as if he was looking at the young prince who didn't like to talk many years ago. He suddenly asked, Your Majesty, have you succeeded? Though the emperor had never said it explicitly, someone as smart as the Grand Secretary could easily guess it. Jingju shook his head and said, Ascension requires breaking through the existing rules. It's the most difficult thing to do in the complete world. It will take me many years to go back. Jingju seldom explained his cultivation even in the real world. Only a few people, such as Zhao Liu, had heard about it. Though Jingju's explanation was short, it was a sincere explanation to Grand Secretary Zhang. Grand Secretary Zhang slapped his thigh regretfully and said, It's a pity that I can't wait for that day. Maybe, Jingju said. Grand Secretary Zhang looked at his face and said very seriously, There are only 4 states left in the world. The Qi kingdom is bloated and weak. Zhao's strength lies in the eunuch he, but eunuchs have no descendants. You don't have to worry too much about it. I've tried my best to manage for many years, but it's hard to change the customs of the people. The imperial court looks good on the surface, but it's actually full of holes. After my death, I'm afraid it will collapse. What are you trying to say? For the sake of the common people, Your Majesty, please come out. Jingju said, Since it's a mess, there's no need to clean it up. If we can't beat them, we'll still fight. More people will die. Grand Secretary Zhang was silent for a long time before saying, Your Majesty's words are reasonable. I am still too stubborn. Jingju said, Except for idiots, everyone has their own stubbornness. Grand Secretary Zhang suddenly laughed, looked at him, and asked, Your Majesty, are you a genius or an idiot? An extremely faint smile appeared in Jingju's eyes as he said, I'm very smart, just a bit lazy. Thinking back on the Emperor's days in the royal palace in the past 30 years, Grand Secretary Zhang was filled with many emotions, saying, I used to wonder how there could be such a lazy person like Your Majesty in the world. Only later did I realize that Your Majesty is an outsider to the world of mortals. It's just that you were born in the royal family. For Your Majesty, this is really a loss. Jingju said, The royal palace is a good place for cultivation, and you are very good, so it's not a loss. Hearing the Emperor's praise, Grand Secretary Zhang was so excited that he almost lost his composure. Forcing himself to calm down, he asked, Your Majesty, are you really an immortal descending to the human world? This was the biggest doubt in his life, and the answer he most wanted to know before his death. Jingju thought about it and said, Yes. Grand Secretary Zhang was shocked speechless, saying, This, really? I can serve Your Majesty for the rest of my life, and I have no regret. Jingju patted his shoulder and said, All in all, you have worked hard over the years. Grand Secretary Zhang couldn't control his emotions any longer, prostrating on the ground with tears streaming down his face, not getting up for a long time. In the early autumn, the Grand Scholar died. The whole Chu kingdom mourned for him, and the whole city was covered with white mourning cloaks. Even Qin State, Zhao State and Qi State had sent their diplomatic missions to offer their condolences. According to the statement from the Grand Scholar Mansion, the old lady requested to keep a low profile, but as the de facto ruler of the Chu kingdom for more than 20 years, it was impossible for her to fulfill her request. Even the most sorrowful and glorious was not enough to describe the scene at the time. With the help of her chief maidservant, the old lady and her 3 sons had been busy for many days, but the eldest young Master Zhang, who had been exiled to the south, didn't show up. Back then, Jingzhou had told Zhao Liu while pointing at Liangwang Peak that any path would have to turn back once it reached its end. It was the same for most things in the world. The Grand Scholar's funeral had many negative effects. The mausoleum was out of control, and the most troublesome part was that the commoners were forbidden from marrying for 100 days, which turned the grief in the hearts of the commoners into complaints. The atmosphere in the capital had gradually changed. One early morning, a few chancellors and princes, led by Grand Secretary Chen, came to the royal palace together, asking to see the emperor. It was unclear what they wanted to talk about. According to the information from the eunuchs in the royal palace, the emperor didn't meet these people. It wasn't until then that many officials and commoners remembered that the Chu kingdom had an emperor. When Grand Secretary Zhang was still alive, these things didn't matter. But now that the Grand Scholar was dead, it was impossible for a second influential official to appear in the imperial court. As such, the position of the emperor became more important. Grand Secretary Zhang had made a lot of preparations before his death. If everything went according to the old plan, the political legacy he had left for the Chu kingdom would still be useful for many years to come. It was a pity that there was no lack of ambition in the officialdom. The greed for power meant that the imperial court couldn't remain peaceful forever. As the third autumn rain fell, the censorate began to act. A dozen memorials were delivered to the secretariat and sent to the governor of a county. After reading those memorials, Grand Secretary Chen and a few chancellors sent them to the royal palace without saying a word. The emperor hadn't used the imperial seal for many years, and it was assumed that it would be no exception this time. However, the behavior of the chancellors in the imperial court was a declaration of their stance. That governor was someone in Grand Secretary Zhang's pocket. To put it more precisely, he was the assistant prime minister that the Grand Scholar had prepared for Jingzhou 10 years later. Once the storm started, it was hard to stop. Soon, the target of the struggle was General Pei. This famous general of the Chu kingdom returned to the capital that very night after drinking a pot of wine. He was immediately sent to prison on charges of bribery, corruption, collaboration with the enemy, and fostering traitors. The last three charges were relatively simple. The problem lay in the charge of bribery. The only official qualified to be bribed by the General Pei was the late Grand Scholar Zhang. The storm turned into a rainstorm. A few officials who still had a grudge against the Grand Scholar soon fell from power, and there were many rumors about Grand Secretary Zhang in the capital. The Grand Scholar was indeed too tough in his later years. There had been a lot of discussions in the officialdom and among the populace, but those discussions had been hidden in the dark and hadn't surfaced until now. In those rumors, Grand Secretary Zhang was said to be extravagant, unfeeling, disrespectful to the emperor, and merciless to the populace. Gradually, or rather quickly, the Grand Scholar had turned from a famous official to a powerful one, and soon he would become the most treacherous official in the history of the Chu kingdom. As the autumn was getting late, an official had finally submitted a memorial requesting that the Grand Secretary Zhang be convicted of 9 major crimes. The Grand Scholar Manor was besieged by the royal army. The chancellors in the imperial court didn't forget the eldest young Master Zhang, who was far away in the south, so they sent the cavalrymen to bring him back. The imperial court didn't use the shackles on the eldest young Master Zhang, nor did they put him in a cage. They didn't even tie him up. Instead, they allowed him to ride a horse with them, but they intentionally leaked the news. The cabbages thrown by the angry populace and the ink splashed by the scholars flew toward him from both sides of the street like a rainstorm, drenching his head and face. Sitting on the horse, the eldest young Master Zhang bit his lips hard, his face pale. He didn't utter a single word. The cries were heard in the Grand Scholar Manor. The old mistress went to the royal prison in a horse-drawn carriage. The royal army was a bit restless, but they didn't stop her. The Grand Scholar Manor had ruled the Chu kingdom for many years. Though it had suffered a heavy blow, it still retained many secret forces. In the dark and gloomy royal prison, the old mistress looked at her eldest son, whom she hadn't seen for many years. She seemed to grow older. The eldest young Master Zhang knelt down on the other side of the iron bars, and said with tears all over his face, "Mother, I'm unfilial. I couldn't see my father off for the last time, and now I have to make you worry about me." The old mistress sat down on the chair with the help of her chief maidservant. She stared into his eyes and asked, "Is the military armament case true?" The eldest young Master Zhang nodded after a moment of silence, saying, "It happened more than 10 years ago. Mother, please forgive me for my foolishness. I've asked someone to check the files. You only took the taels of silver in the military armament case, nothing else. Why are you talking about foolishness?" The old mistress said tiredly, "The amount of silver your father has embezzled in his whole life is much more than this." The eldest young Master Zhang walked forward on his knees and grabbed the iron bars, asking, "What do those bastards in the imperial court want to do?" The old mistress sneered, "What do they want to do? Of course they want to ruin your father completely and trample on him." The eldest young Master Zhang said after a moment of silence, "My side is simple, but how can they punish my father?" The old mistress said quietly, "That's why they brought the emperor out." The eldest young Master Zhang was very surprised, saying, "That idiotic emperor?" The old mistress said, "It's said that your father fabricated the case of Crown Prince Jing in order to imprison His Majesty in the palace. This is a great crime, punishable by the execution of 9 generations." The eldest young Master Zhang's face turned even paler, saying, "Father was indeed disrespectful to His Majesty. Could it be true?" The old mistress said, "The person your father respects the most in his life is His Majesty. How could he do such a disgraceful thing?" The eldest young Master Zhang didn't believe what she said at all. He said with a bitter smile, "No matter what, I can't do it. I don't want to be humiliated by these thieves." The old mistress said, "I came to see you tonight because I was worried that you would really do something stupid." The eldest young Master Zhang was slightly surprised and asked, "Is there still room to turn things around?" The old mistress said, "Before your father died, he said that we don't need to do anything. Everything will be fine." The eldest young Master Zhang didn't understand his father's last words and asked, "What does that mean?" The old mistress said, "I don't quite understand either, but I think it has something to do with the royal seal." Thinking of the rumor, the eldest young Master Zhang felt some hope and asked, "Is the royal seal really gone?" The old mistress said, "I guess the royal seal has been returned to His Majesty by your father. The officials in the court don't have the seal now. How can they punish the Zhang family?" The rain in late autumn was extremely cold. The Grand Secretary Chun, together with the Minister of Rites and other officials, stood outside the hall and waited for an hour, but the Emperor still didn't summon him. Seeing it getting late, the Grand Scholar Chun took the lead in leaving after shooting a glance at the crowd. Walking through the gate of the royal palace, he asked in a barely discernible voice, "Is it really in that hall?" The Minister of Rites, Jin Qing, was the most valued disciple of the Grand Secretary Zhang. He was only in his 40s this year. No one had expected that he would be the first official to attack the Grand Secretary Manor. The headmaster stayed in the palace for half a night. No one knows what he said to His Majesty. Jin Qing said calmly, "But since the next day, no one has seen the royal seal in the imperial cabinet." The Grand Secretary Chun narrowed his eyes and said, "It seems that His Majesty regards the seal as a life-saving treasure. What do you think?" Jin Qing said expressionlessly, "It's autumn and the weather is dry. We should be careful of the candles." Chapter 393. I really like that name, but it's not suitable for me today. I'll find another one with the same flavor tomorrow. How to bring down an important figure like Grand Secretary Zhang, who had the right to represent history. History itself had given a clear answer many times. After he died, the emperor, who had been dissatisfied for many years, would settle the score. At the very least, he would use the name of the emperor. Therefore, the charges that Grand Secretary Chun, Jin Qing, and others had prepared for Grand Secretary Zhang were all related to disrespect. However, this kind of operation required the approval of the emperor, so they naturally had to show enough respect to the emperor and give up enough benefits, unless they wanted to rebel. Unfortunately, they didn't have the power or the ambition. At most, they could only hope that they could control the emperor to control the Chu kingdom. Therefore, when Jingju didn't want to see them, they couldn't do anything. They also couldn't force their way into the palace to find the imperial seal. What was the difference between that and the charges they had prepared for Grand Secretary Zhang? Fortunately, the imperial palace was under strict control of the imperial court. There was no such thing as an internal court. Those eunuchs and palace maids hadn't even seen the emperor many times, so it was easy to arrange some accidents. It was a hot autumn night. It was a good time to set fire. Prime President Jin didn't leave the cabinet. He stared in the direction of the imperial palace across the square, waiting for the fire to appear. However, when morning came, his eyes were so dry that they hurt. The imperial palace was still quiet. Nothing happened. There was still no news until evening. There wasn't even any sign that they had failed. The eunuchs who had set the fire had disappeared. The city gate department didn't find them. The guards and the imperial army didn't find them either. It was as if they had disappeared into thin air. Prime President Jin felt that things were a bit strange. He felt a faint chill in his heart. He used several hot towels to warm his face to dispel his sleepiness and chill. Then, he went to Grand Secretary Chen's manor. He didn't know what Grand Secretary Chen said to him. From the movements in the imperial palace, they didn't seem to have given up the idea of setting the palace on fire. However, from that night onwards, the autumn rain in the capital city became endless and did not stop for even a moment. Perhaps because of the autumn rain, the palace never caught fire. The pitter-patter of raindrops falling from the gloomy clouds brought with them a chill that invaded the clothes and blankets. It was very annoying. The officials in the imperial court were naturally the most annoyed. One day, Grand Secretary Chen called Prime President Jin in private and said, "The opportunity is now, don't miss it." Jin Cheng understood what he meant. Everything in the world, including fame, status, power, wealth, and even cultivation, would fall when it reached its peak. It was the same with public opinion. It was the moment when the populace of the Chu kingdom resented Grand Secretary Zhang the most. If the imperial court didn't seize the opportunity, those scholars and populace might start to miss the Grand Secretary whom they had trampled into the mud after this period of time, and it would be more troublesome for them to deal with the matter at that time. That night, someone sent a message to the eldest young Master Zhang in the imperial prison, saying that if he confessed to the case of the ordinance, the matter would end there. Otherwise, sitting in the haystack, the eldest young Master Zhang thought of the cabbages and ink thrown at him from both sides of the street on the day when he was escorted back to the capital by the cavalrymen, and a despairing expression appeared in his eyes. Did his father really say that before his death? Nothing would go wrong if he didn't do anything? Even if his father did say that, it was impossible. It was not the first time that he had misjudged the situation. The eldest young Master Zhang remembered the conversation he had with his father many years ago. At the time, he knelt before the sickbed and begged his father to consider his future affairs with tears all over his face. Was he going to watch his sons die or be exiled? His father refused his request severely, telling him not to mention it again and that nothing would happen to them. Later, his father even exiled him to the south. But what about now? He was about to die in the imperial prison, and the Grand Secretary's manor was besieged and was about to be raided. The chancellors in the imperial court used to be your good friends and students, but now they want to dig you out from your grave and whip your corpse. It has been like this in history. Why can't you understand it? Looking at the white silk and the bottle of poison left on the ground by the intruder, the corners of the eldest young Master Zhang's mouth twitched slightly, and a neurotic smile appeared on his face. He suddenly yelled miserably, "Jin Cheng, you will die a horrible death." It was quiet in the prison, and nobody came to stop him. Only his miserably cursing echoed in the cell. The white silk was tied to the top of the iron bars, fluttering gently, like the white banners in the graveyard. It broke with a cracking sound. The eldest young Master Zhang fell on the haystack, feeling bewildered. He found the bottle of poison, opened it with trembling hands, and poured it into his mouth. A moment later, he found that the bottle, which was supposed to contain poison, was filled with clear water. He came back to his senses and looked at the dark and gloomy outside the cell warily. "Who is it?" he asked in a low voice. A man in black walked out from the shadow and said, "It's so troublesome. I hope you won't try to hit your head against the wall again." The eldest young Master Zhang was surprised. The imperial prison of the Chu kingdom was heavily guarded, and the formations were hidden behind the stone walls. Even the most formidable swordsmen and cultivation practitioners couldn't sneak in. "Who are you? Why did you save me? I'm just a worker. Do you think I want to meddle in other people's business?" The man in black had a broken hand, and his sleeve drooped down weakly, just like his voice. "I have many important things to do. I was about to go to Zhao State to kill that eunuch and the White Emperor, but I was summoned here by someone." Having heard this, the eldest young Master Zhang's pupils contracted, and he asked in a trembling voice, "Are you a man in black?" The man looked at his clothes and asked in confusion, "Is there something wrong with your eyes?" The eldest young Master Zhang murmured, "You're not dead yet." The man in black he mentioned was not a man in black, but a specific name for a certain person in this world. Many years ago, a powerful swordsman who liked to fight and kill appeared in this world. It was said that he was second only to Duke Missouri. His fighting capacity was extremely formidable, and he killed countless swordsmen in the four kingdoms of Qin, Zhao, Qi, and Chu. When the swordsman appeared, he was dressed in black, so he was called the Man in Black. It was said that the Man in Black left the Central Plains and went to the West regions to cultivate and break the state. Who would have thought that he would come back again? The eldest young Master Zhang stared into his eyes and said, "You haven't answered my question. Why did you save me?" The Man in Black didn't pay any attention to him. He broke open the iron bars, knocked him unconscious and carried him out. The Blue Bird had asked him to protect the lives of the people in the imperial prison. The general and the rest of the officials were strong-willed and didn't want to commit suicide. This eldest young Master Zhang was indeed troublesome, so it was the simplest way to deal with him. The Man in Black was Zhuoruzhui, who handled the matter so casually and lazily. However, no matter how powerful an assassin was, he couldn't fight against the imperial court head-on. Zhuoruzhui left the imperial prison with the unconscious eldest young Master Zhang, and disappeared from the capital of the Chu kingdom. Like a drop of water falling into the ocean, it didn't cause any ripples. The autumn wind and rain were as worrisome as usual. The news that the eldest young Master Zhang had escaped from the prison didn't worry the officials of the imperial court too much. On the contrary, they felt relieved. In this way, they could finally take another step forward. They could seize this opportunity to confiscate the Grand Scholar Manor. They believed that even if they couldn't find the royal seal and the emperor didn't show up, the Zhang family would be sentenced to death. With this thought in mind, the Minister of Rites, Jin Qing, came to the outside of the Grand Scholar Manor. The front gate of the Grand Scholar Manor had been smashed open, and hundreds of soldiers had entered the manor and occupied all the important places. They had already started to search the manor. It was a chaotic scene, with overturned cabinets, collapsed flower racks, and cries everywhere. Even the rockery in the back garden had been dug up, revealing a secret room full of golden bricks. Jin Qing furrowed his brows slightly, feeling displeased. He instructed his subordinates by his side, "Behave yourself. Don't startle the madam." The subordinates responded in unison, but they were complaining in their minds, thinking that the Prime Minister was the most valued student of the Grand Scholar Manor back in the day. "Were you going to keep on pretending?" The sound of cursing suddenly came from the deep end of the Grand Scholar Manor, as well as the sound of a heavy object falling to the ground. Prime President Jin's brows furrowed even more, as he walked in that direction. The subordinate explained in a low voice, "The back house has been controlled, but it's a bit inconvenient for the madam to live in the back garden." Prime President Jean didn't halt his steps, and asked in a low voice, "Have you put the object away?" The subordinate replied in an even lower voice, "It's at the bottom of the suitcase, there's nothing wrong with it." Prime President Jean uttered and didn't say anything more. Soon, he arrived at the outside of the back garden. The back garden was even more messy. A few female servants had been pushed to the ground, their foreheads bleeding, and cloth and clothes were scattered everywhere. Seeing the scene in front of him, Prime President Jean showed a hint of sympathy in his eyes. He had been to the Grand Scholar Manor many times, and he often came to the back garden. Not long ago, he had fed his teacher the medicine in this place several times. Seeing his expression, a few subordinates persuaded him to do something appropriate, such as, "The affairs of the state are more important," and "the master." The expression on Prime President Jin's face eased up a bit. Looking at the chaotic scene around him, he let out a self-mocking smile. It was a royal robe. In the past 20 years, he had been trying to persuade his teacher to ascend the throne and become the emperor, but his teacher had always disagreed. Now that his teacher was dead, Prime President Jean decided to prepare a royal robe for him as a show of filial piety. There was a large pearwood chest in the Granny Dowager's room, and the royal robe was at the bottom of the chest. Looking at the tightly closed door, Prime President Jean tidied up his clothes and said calmly, "Master's wife, please open the door." There was a faint sound in the room, but nobody opened the door. As time passed slowly, Prime President Jin's expression grew cold, and he said sternly, "Break the door open." Ignoring the cries and curses of the female servants, a dozen soldiers climbed up the stairs and broke the door open easily, entering the room in a single file. However, these soldiers quickly retreated from the room with a strange expression on their faces, as if they had seen a ghost. A person walked out of the room. His hair was disheveled, and his face couldn't be seen clearly, but the bright yellow royal robe he was wearing was very eye-catching. Seeing the royal robe, the official in charge of this matter changed his expression abruptly, wondering how someone had found the clothes hidden at the bottom of the chest and put them on. No matter who it was, wearing the royal robe was a capital offense, and it came from the Granny Dowager's room. How could the Grand Scholar Manor get away with it? How dare he wear the royal robe? "Arrest this treacherous thief for me," the official ordered sternly, but he didn't notice the commotion around him. Looking at the man wearing the royal robe, Prime President Jin's face turned pale. The man raised his hands and parted his black hair, revealing his handsome face. "I'm the emperor, what should I wear if not the royal robe?" he asked nonchalantly. Chapter 394. Few people in the Chu kingdom had seen the emperor, who had lived in seclusion in the palace for decades. For example, the officials and soldiers who raided the Grand Secretary's mansion today had never seen the emperor. Seeing the man walking out of Madame Dowager's room, they were all stunned, wondering if he was a lunatic. Minister Jean Cheng was very experienced. He had entered the court when he was young and had the honor of meeting His Majesty at the coronation ceremony 20 years ago. At that time, His Majesty was only a 10-year-old boy. Now he should be 30 years old, considered middle-aged. But why was his face still so beautiful after parting his black hair? His Majesty's sudden appearance in the scholar's mansion, his plot being foiled, and his appearance being the same as before, these three matters were like 3 bolts of lightning that directly struck Minister Jin's heart. He subconsciously knelt down and stammered, "Long live you!" Only then did the officials and soldiers react. They were shocked speechless and knelt down unevenly. The old mistress walked out of the room with the help of her crutches, just in time to see the whole mansion kneeling down like a tide. Jingju turned to her and said, "I promised him that as long as I am the emperor, I will guarantee you a lifetime of riches and honor." Hearing this, the madam was even more agitated. She knelt down shakily and said, "Thank you for your pity, your majesty." It was deathly quiet in the Grand Scholar manor, and then a burst of crying broke out. The cries came from the descendants of Grand Secretary Zhang, as well as the housekeepers and servants. When the imperial court confiscated the houses of the Grand Scholar manor that day, there had been many cries in the Grand Scholar manor. However, those cries were of grievance and fear at the time, and now they were cries of joy and happiness after escaping from a catastrophe. Among the crimes that the imperial court had assigned to the Grand Scholar, the one that couldn't be cleared of was the crime of imprisoning the emperor, which was treason. Today, the emperor came to the Grand Scholar manor in person, and his words had been confirmed. Who dared object? Prime President Jean knelt on the ground. When he heard this, his expression changed and he finally came to his senses. If the situation continued to develop like this, all the preparations he and the officials in the court would be for naught. How could he allow such a thing to happen? Even if the emperor was not an idiot, he probably did not know a single official after being imprisoned in the palace for 20 years. What power did he have? So what if he died? The power brought by ambition and greed supported Prime President Jean to stand up. He stared into Jingzhou's eyes and prepared to shout out the most crucial words. This person is fake. How dare you impersonate His Majesty the Emperor? This is a great crime punishable by death by 1,000 cuts. It's not too much to kill you with a flurry of blades, right? In order to conceal the royal robe worn by the Grand Scholar manor in private, the Grand Scholar manor had dared to let someone pretend to be the emperor. It was not an exaggeration to say that the whole family of the Grand Scholar manor would be executed. In a very short period of time, Prime President Jean thought of many things. Many scenes flashed before his eyes, and all of them were blood. In the next moment, he realized that he didn't make a sound. Hundreds of officials and soldiers knelt on the ground, looking at him with a strange expression. Prime President Jin's mouth was agape, and his face was filled with horror. The only sound he could hear was his own heartbeat. Dong, 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 dong. His heart beat faster and faster, like a rapid drum beat, as if it was about to jump out of his throat. It was even faster. An indescribable pain burst out from his chest and spread to all parts of his body. If he could make a sound, he would have screamed like a wounded beast. But he couldn't, so he could only look at Jingzhou in horror. Looking at those eyes that were as deep as the ocean, Prime President Jean suddenly understood many things. Why his teacher didn't dare to usurp the throne, why the emperor shut himself in the palace, why the crown prince Jing came to the capital and died, why the fire in the palace didn't light up when the autumn rain didn't fall. Unfortunately, he understood it too late. The strong remorse, despair, and fear made him cough painfully. Blood spurted out from his lips like a mist. There were screams in the hall. He continued to cough, his body bent like a cooked shrimp, blood spurting out incessantly. In the end, he even coughed up some pieces of flesh and blood. Jingzhou took the hairband from the dowager's hand and tied up his black hair. He walked past Prime President Jean and headed for the outside of the Grand Secretary's mansion, not even looking at this person. The dowager saw him off with a humble expression, leaning on her walking stick. When she passed by Prime President Jean, she spat on his face. That mouthful of saliva was like a hammer, and Minister Jean directly fell to the ground. He twitched a few times and then stopped breathing. That night, all the officials in the capital of the Chu Kingdom who were qualified to attend the court meeting received a notice that there would be a court meeting the next day. In fact, the royal palace only sent a eunuch to inform Grand Secretary Chen. It could be imagined that the emperor, who hadn't been out of the palace for 20 years, didn't have anyone he could use. This fact didn't make the officials who received the notice feel at ease, because what had happened in the Grand Secretary's mansion had spread throughout the capital. Before dawn, carriages appeared one after another on the road leading to the royal palace. Some officials were still talking to the caretakers of their mansions by the windows. They weren't talking about their last words, but preparing for the great change that might happen that day. Few chancellors were willing to wait for death, even when faced with the imperial power, not to mention that the imperial power was nothing in the history of the Chu kingdom in the last few decades. The door of the hall opened slowly. The officials looked at each other, stopped talking, and walked in slowly, lining up in 2 rows according to the usual practice. No one liked to attend court meetings, but it was necessary to govern a country. The court meetings had never stopped, but it had been many years since the emperor came to the court in person. Some chancellors remembered that the last time the emperor came to the court meeting was during the enthronement ceremony. Some officials with good memories remembered that when Grand Secretary Zhang was impeached, the emperor came to the court and said, "The Grand Secretary has done a good job, so don't make trouble." Are we still making trouble in the eyes of the emperor after the death of the Grand Secretary? What trouble does the emperor want to make? Looking at the yellow-robed man sitting high on the throne, many officials had all sorts of thoughts in their minds. Then, their gazes were quickly drawn to that extremely handsome face. They were very shocked, thinking that His Majesty was actually such a handsome man. His black hair was only casually tied behind his head, so how could he have the grace of an immortal? Jingju didn't care what these chancellors were thinking, saying, "Let's begin." A young eunuch glanced at the list in his hand nervously, and was about to speak. It was then that Grand Secretary Chen suddenly stepped forward and bowed to Jingzhou, saying, "Your Majesty, I have something to ask you." Jingzhou glanced at this person, but didn't say anything. Grand Secretary Chen said, "Yesterday, the Minister of Rights, Jin Qing, was ordered to inspect the Zhang Manor. Why were you there, Your Majesty? And why did Prime President Jin suddenly die?" These 2 questions were extremely rude, and what was more rude was that he had been staring into Jingzhou's eyes while he was asking the questions, showing no respect to the emperor. Grand Secretary Chen stared into Jingzhou's eyes, trying to figure out something from them. Yesterday, the emperor suddenly appeared in the Zhang Manor, and Jin Qing suddenly died. He was so shocked that he finally remembered a secret rumor. The Grand Secretary Zhang didn't want to do anything to the emperor, because he knew that the emperor had been making magic pills and cultivating. In today's court meeting, Grand Secretary Chen wanted to know if this rumor was true or not. Of course, he had already prepared for it. Even if the emperor was a cultivation practitioner with a high cultivation state, he still couldn't change the general trend of the entire Chu kingdom. Jingju didn't want to answer this question. The young eunuch was very smart. He suppressed his nervousness and rebuked, "Following the imperial decree? His Majesty didn't give the decree. Whose decree are you following?" The young eunuch's voice was very shrill. Because of his nervousness, it was somewhat hoarse. It sounded like a little rooster being squeezed by the neck. It was very unpleasant. Such an unpleasant voice echoed in the empty great hall. Grand Secretary Chen was slightly startled and didn't know how to answer. Jingju didn't want this boring process to continue. Looking at the officials in the great hall, he said, "Grand Secretary Zhang was chosen by me. If you touch him, you will be touching me." These words were very rude and meaningless. They didn't match the temperament of officialdom and sounded more like the tone of a Jianghu man. Hearing these words, the officials didn't feel afraid. On the contrary, they felt it was funny. Some of them even laughed out loud. Jingju didn't pay any attention to them. He continued, "That will cause the death of the entire family." These words were very indifferent, without any killing intent. They weren't like thunder, but like a gust of wind. However, they made everyone in the great hall feel an extreme chill. The young eunuch took 2 steps forward with the list in his arms. He nervously swallowed and began to read out the names. The officials whose names he had called stepped forward with a bewildered expression. There were only 7 or 8 of them. The officials whose names weren't called were also puzzled, wondering what was going on. The young eunuch thought about what he was going to say next. His expression became even more nervous, and his voice became hoarser. He wasn't a great person. It was just that a few nights ago, when he woke up, he found a few dark figures sneaking into the great hall to set fire. He summoned up his courage and shouted. After shouting, he thought he would die. Unexpectedly, the fire didn't start and he didn't die. Instead, he became the Emperor's trusted aide. Of course, it could also be because the Emperor only knew him, the young eunuch. Thinking of these things, the young eunuch's nervousness was relieved. He cleared his throat and said to the officials in the great hall, "The officials whose names were called are innocent. The rest are unforgivable." Before he could finish his sentence, he was interrupted. There was an uproar in the great hall. The officials looked at Jingjiu on the throne, their gazes filled with shock. Was the world really going to change? "Your Majesty, you don't have anything. You don't have any officials, troops, guards, or even eunuchs. You only have this immature child, yet you want to wipe out the entire Chu country's bureaucracy? Where did this crazy idea come from? Was His Majesty really as the rumors said? If he wasn't an idiot, then he was a madman. Does His Majesty want to use the imperial seal to decide the world?" Grand Secretary Chen laughed. Looking at Jingjiu on the throne, his face full of pity, he said, "The capital, the provinces, the officials, the soldiers, the scholars, and the common people are all clear-headed people, who would listen to you, even if you could persuade some of the guards, or even yourself." He paused here and didn't finish his conjecture. The mockery on his face was very strong. A general sneered, "Even if you could keep us in the imperial palace for a while, what use would it be?" Yes, even if Jingjiu could find a way to seal the imperial palace, he would have no way of keeping these officials in the imperial palace for a long time and forcing them to acknowledge his authority. These officials had made preparations before entering the imperial palace. As long as they stayed for a long time, the stewards and family generals of the various manors would be dispatched, and the camps outside the capital would be brought in. It would be very simple for the imperial army to choose between an idiotic emperor who had been imprisoned for many years and the entire imperial court. How long could the imperial palace hold out? Once the imperial palace was breached, what would your Majesty do? Grand Secretary Chen looked into Jingjiu's eyes in silence, waiting for his answer. Jingjiu said, "I've never thought of keeping you here." With these words, the door of the great hall suddenly closed. A shadow fell on everyone's bodies and hearts. The young eunuch had been warned in advance. Holding the name list in his bosom, he led the officials whose names had been called to hide in a corner behind the throne. It was very gloomy inside the great hall, but it was sunny outside. Zhuoruzhui leaned against the door of the great hall, squinting at the rising sun, exuding a sense of laziness all over his body. The eldest young Master Zhang stood beside him and asked with a pale face, "Is that all? What else?" Zhuoruzhui said with drooping eyelids, "The name list was written by you yourself. If there's a mistake, it's your fault." The eldest son of the grand scholar Zhang said anxiously, "Am I talking about the name list? I said His Majesty is in the great hall." A scream suddenly rang out in the great hall, followed by the incessant sound of a sharp object cutting through flesh. The eldest young Master Zhang could not see the scene in the great hall, so he could only guess. He was so nervous that he began to retch, but since he had not eaten anything, he could not vomit. Just then, a muffled sound came from the door of the great hall, followed by a faint cry for help. It should be the ministers banging on the door, trying to run out. The eldest young Master Zhang had no time to care about the annoyance in his heart, and hurriedly used his shoulder to block the door. His face was full of fear, and his sweat was pouring down like rain. Looking at his embarrassed appearance, Zhuoruzhui was very satisfied, and said, "Not bad, this is the time to show off. You should know that you used to be an assassin. Your father was afraid that you would be killed by the emperor, so he banished you to the south to avoid trouble. Your emperor is very stingy. If you don't do something now, he might kill you when he remembers what happened in the past. At such a tense moment, the eldest young Master Zhang did not listen to what he said, and only tried his best to block the door of the Great Hall. A stream of blood splashed on the door of the Great Hall, and he was so scared that he shivered. He shouted crazily, "Why don't you go in and help?" In his opinion, since the man in black was the most powerful assassin in the world, even if he could not help His Majesty kill these rebels, he could at least save His Majesty. Zhuoruzhui said inexplicably, "Why do we need to worry about him?" The eldest young Master Zhang misunderstood him, and his eyes became excited, and he said, "How many bodyguards are there in the Great Hall? Or did you invite many highly skilled cultivators to come here?" "Only him." Zhuoruzhui did not care that this sentence made the face of the eldest young Master Zhang even paler. He waved his hand to signal the eunuchs not far away to come over, and said, "You go and prepare some clean water first. Remember, a lot of clean water. Otherwise, when the blood coagulates, it will be very troublesome to clean it up." In fact, neither he nor the eldest young Master Zhang understood why these middle-aged eunuchs were so bold and dared to stay here at such a time. The eunuchs smiled apologetically and said, "Don't worry, masters. We have done this a few times." Not long after, the sound in the great hall disappeared, and the silence was frightening. The eldest young Master Zhang looked inside with some fear, but he could not see anything. His shoulders slowly moved away from the door of the great hall. The door of the great hall slowly opened, and Jingzhou walked out. His hair was disheveled, and his body was covered in blood. He held a sword in his right hand, and his face was a little pale. The eldest young Master Zhang hurriedly knelt down, and did not dare to raise his head to look. Jingzhou looked into the distance and said, "Tell your mother that this hair rope is not strong enough." Chapter 395. This chapter was supposed to be the last chapter where the lights in the room dimmed, unable to shine through my body. Fortunately, I am very satisfied with the title. In the Great Hall, Grand Secretary Chen and a general had said in a mocking tone that even if Jingzhou could trap these officials in the palace, it would be useless. Jingzhou had never thought of doing this. He had killed them all. Dozens of officials lay in pools of blood, and he had paid a price. Those generals had some ability, and Grand Secretary Chen had made preparations beforehand. He had invited a few powerful cultivators to pretend to be officials and enter the hall. The morning sun shone on his pale face. He looked at the distant sky outside the royal palace and thought of some things that had happened a long time ago and a long time later. History was always repeating itself. The only difference was that his cultivation level here was somewhat low. The young eunuch led the surviving officials out from the corner of the great hall. Looking at the pools of blood on the ground and thinking of the cruel and bloody scenes from before, the officials' legs turned to jelly. They forced themselves to walk out of the hall. Seeing the emperor covered in blood and holding a sword, they didn't dare to look him in the eye. With a few thuds, they knelt down. "If you can still walk, go and take care of this matter." Jingzhou's voice was devoid of any emotion. The officials didn't dare to tarry. Propping themselves up with their hands, they walked out of the palace as fast as they could. There were still many things they needed to do. Comforting the imperial army was the first step, and rescuing the officials from the imperial prison was the second. There was a slight commotion outside the royal palace, but it quickly calmed down. Before long, the palace gates were opened again. Dozens of officials came to the hall and knelt before Jingzhou. These people had just left the imperial prison and were still wearing their prison uniforms. They looked extremely wretched. Great General Pei and Governor Zhou knelt at the very front. The former was Grand Secretary Zhang's most trusted general and had the highest prestige in the Chu kingdom. The latter's status was much lower, but he was the future prime minister that Grand Secretary Zhang had prepared for Jingzhou. They had heard from their colleagues what had happened in the hall today, and could not believe it. Only now, when they saw dozens of eunuchs and palace maids, under the command of a few eunuchs, splashing clean water into the hall and seeing the blood flowing out of the hall like a waterfall and flowing down the stone steps, did they confirm with shock that it was true. His Majesty had almost killed all the officials in the court. Jingjiu looked at General Pei and said, "Go to the barracks outside the city. If there are any problems in the capital, directly extinguish them." General Pei's expression changed. Governor Zhou was worried that His Majesty did not understand the complexity of the current situation and said, "The capital camp will not listen to General Pei's orders. All the manors in the capital have long been prepared, and those princes and dukes will definitely not be content with their lot. Perhaps they will take advantage of the chaos to stir up trouble. Your Majesty, you are the people chosen by the Grand Scholar. If you can't even handle such a small matter, his judgment is a bit too poor." Thinking of Grand Secretary Chen, who had died in the hall, and Prime President Jin, who had died the day before, Jingjiu realized that Grand Secretary Zhang's judgment was indeed not very good, except that he had understood him. In short, don't bother me with such trifles, not today and not in the future. In this aspect, you should learn from him. Having said this, he turned around and walked toward the cold palace. Zhuoruzhui yawned and followed him out. The rusted lock had been removed, and the side door, which was used to deliver miscellaneous goods, had been sealed shut. Other than this, the cold palace had not changed much. It was still as cold and cheerless as ever. Jingjiu threw the badly damaged sword into the pool, changed his clothes, and leaned back on the bed. The blood on his body had long since been washed clean. Standing in front of the bed, Zhuoruzhui said, "If I hadn't lost my arm that time, I would have forgotten most of what had happened in the outside world." Jingjiu said, "You are going to compete for the fairy book. The green sky mirror won't let you forget this, but it doesn't matter if you forget other things." "What are you going to do, Senior Master?" asked Zhuoruzhui. "What about you?" asked Jingjiu. "I still have the same idea, which is to cultivate and kill people here." Zhuoruzhui said matter-of-factly, "If I kill all the other participants in the Dao competition, the fairy book will belong to Aoyama. Even if I fail, I won't have wasted the last few decades." Jingjiu said, "I'm almost at the same level." The disciples of Aoyama were always straightforward in their actions, so it was not surprising that they had a similar plan. Yet, Zhuoruzhui didn't understand why Jingjiu hid in the royal palace every day if he wanted to cultivate and kill other participants in the Dao competition. Jingjiu was fully aware that he wouldn't get an answer even if he asked Jingjiu. He didn't know how helpless Tong Yin was when she died back then. He raised his hand and bowed to Jingjiu, ready to leave. "Where are you going?" Jingjiu asked. Zhuoruzhui said, "I'm going to Zhao State to kill that eunuch." Jingjiu said, "He Zhan is a bit abnormal. Be careful." After Zhuoruzhui left, it was even quieter in the palace hall. The capital would be in chaos that day. It was unclear if General Pei, Governor Zhou and the others could stabilize the situation, and it was also unclear how many people would die in the end. Sitting on the bed, Jingjiu looked at the sky outside the window in silence. He maintained this posture for a long time. No one knew what he was thinking, but it probably had nothing to do with the chaos in the capital. As the sky shifted, people would occasionally come to the outside of the palace hall to report on the current situation. Interestingly enough, the messenger was not the young eunuch, but the eldest young Master Zhang. Perhaps in the eyes of General Pei, Governor Zhou, and the others, the eldest young Master Zhang was the person whom His Majesty trusted the most. Jingjiu didn't reply. He continued to look outside the window in silence. The sun gradually set. After dusk came night, and the light in the palace hall grew dim. At some point, a lamp was lit in the palace hall. Flutter, flutter. The blue bird flapped its wings and flew into the palace hall. It landed on the bed and turned into that cute little girl. Jingjiu asked, "Is it settled?" Qing said, "The rebellion in the barracks and the imperial army outside the city has been suppressed by Pei Siming. The residences of the ministers are under control. You don't have to worry." Jingjiu said, "I didn't." Qing said with slight annoyance, "Those people outside like to watch the chaos of war, so I can use those scenes to fool them. But I have to show them some scenes of you. I remember you saying that I cultivate and sleep here every day. Those people outside the Huin Valley have long since grown tired of seeing me. But the scene of you killing people in the palace hall today is what they like to see the most. I didn't show it, and I don't know how many complaints I've caused. Scenes that can't be seen directly might be even more exciting. That makes sense. No wonder there are so many good reviews. No need to thank me. You don't have to be so polite." Qing said somewhat angrily, "Don't always have me be a messenger in the future. What if Bai Jinren becomes suspicious?" Jingjiu said, "I'll be careful." The dim light fell on his body. Because he had killed people during the day, his face was a bit pale, and his expression was a bit tired. His black hair draped over his shoulders, displaying a kind of decadent beauty. Seeing this scene, Qing was in a trance. She came back to her senses after a while, and exclaimed in surprise, "You've lit a lamp?" Jingjiu uttered This palace hall was seldom lit by a lamp. It was not until a few days ago when the Grand Secretary Zhang came here before his death that the lamp was lit. Thinking of what had happened in the last few days, Qing asked confusedly, "You've been concentrating on cultivation and don't care about other things. Why are you willing to do it this time?" Jingjiu said, "Cultivation requires a quiet place. What I did was no different from a bear getting rid of the threat outside its cave." Qing asked while looking at him, "Is that true? Is that all?" "Of course," Jingjiu said. Qing curled her lips and said, "Maybe it's true, but I still think that your action has something to do with the Grand Secretary." "Maybe it's true," Jingjiu said. Qing's eyes lit up as she asked, "What's so different about the Grand Secretary? For him, you are fake, but for you, well, he might be real. No, since you will leave the illusionary realm, and will probably never come back in this lifetime, and even if you come back, you won't be able to see him again. So, he is also fake to you, right?" There were too many truths and falsehoods in this statement, and it was hard to tell the truth from the falsehood. Qing stared into his eyes and said, "According to what you said, those who leave and never come back are all fake. But why did you do it?" Looking at the dim lamp, Jingjiu said, "Because there are many things in the world that have nothing to do with what is true and what is false." It was quiet outside the Huin Valley. The light screen in the sky was still in that scene. The dim lamp in the palace hall was fading away, and the lights in the capital city were brightly lit. The hooves of the cavalrymen trod on the green stone road, and the cries grew softer. Nobody had heard the conversation between the Bluebird and Jingjiu, but they had seen the whole story. No matter how calm the cultivation practitioners were, they would still feel a bit frustrated when they saw the lights in the scene and thought of the joys and sorrows they had seen in the past 30 days. Sensei's eyes were wet, but it was unclear if she was crying for Jingjiu and Grand Secretary Zhang, or for some other reason. Standing by a cliff in the distance, Tong Yen fell silent for a long time, thinking of what Jingjiu had said in the end. Those were all fake. The cultivation practitioners had all heard similar words in their pursuit of the Tao. They might come from their masters or their colleagues, but they were not as certain as what Jingjiu had said. Many cultivation practitioners would have the illusion that they could come into contact with reality by recognizing the falsehood, and they would be able to sever their emotions and nature. But as Jingjiu had said, there were many things in the world that had nothing to do with what was true and what was false. Who could really sever their emotions and nature? In other words, why should they sever their emotions and nature? The footsteps burst out behind the cliff. Tong Yen turned around and found it was the thin and dark disciple of the No Mercy sect. "What do you think of what your young master said?" she asked suddenly. Chapter 396. Normally, Lu Shui should have turned around and left, or tried to contact the Immortal Sect Master. For some reason, he didn't leave, but started to seriously consider Tong Yan's question. It didn't take long for him to give his answer. "I have no opinion on young master's words." Tong Yan said. Before he said this today, everyone thought that Jing Jiu cultivated the unfeeling path. "Aren't you worried?" Lu Shui didn't understand, asking, "Worried about what?" Tong Yan said, "How can we travel together when we have different paths?" Lu Shui understood what he meant and said with relief, "No matter what path it is, it's fine as long as we can go up the mountain. Why do we have to travel together?" Tong Yan looked at him in silence for a while and suddenly said, "You are the smart one." Lu Shui explained, "I'm not stupid. It's just that young master is too smart, which makes me look stupid." Tong Yan raised her eyebrows and asked, "What do you think about the outcome of the Tao competition?" Lu Shui said, "The fairy book is of course young master's." Tong Yan thought it was unnecessary to ask this question, so she suddenly asked, "Aren't you worried that I'll expose your identity?" The whole cultivation world thought that Lu Shui had been imprisoned in the sword jail to reflect on his actions. If people knew that he had left, the 9 peaks of Aoyama would be in chaos. For instance, Fang Jingtian, the master of Shilai Peak, who was watching the competition not far away, would definitely take this opportunity to make trouble. Lu Shui knew that Tong Yan was trying to test something, such as whether the Immortal Sect Master knew about it. Since he didn't leave, he must have thought of a way to deal with it. Looking at Tong Yan, he said with a smile, "Back then, Miss Baizao said that the Zhongzhou school owed me a favor. I'll use it here." Tong Yan knew that this matter was related to Lo Huainan's death, but she didn't expect that Lu Shui would bring it up at this time. Was he playing dumb or something? He looked at Lu Shui and discovered that Lu Shui's smile was actually so sincere. He couldn't help but laugh at himself, thinking that it was indeed meaningless to be smart before sincerity. He didn't say anything else, nor did he look at the scene in the sky. He flew away. Lu Shui also left the edge of the cliff. Thinking of Jing Jiu's order, he naturally wouldn't go too far. Sensei wipes away the tears on her face. She can't bear to watch the story in that world anymore, so she asks Shuiyu Nunnery to accompany her out for a walk. However, the fishes in the valley suffer. 5 days later, after having eaten a dozen grilled fish, fish slices, fried fish and fried fish, Sensei's mood had improved, and she returned to the valley. As she was talking to Shuiyu Nunnery about the delicious grilled fish cooked by Hejan, she lifted her head and saw Hejan's face in the sky. The face in the sky was not exactly the same as Hejan's true appearance. It was fairer, and he didn't have a single mustache on his face, which made him look more feminine. He wore a black overcoat. Looking at a dozen generals kneeling in front of him, his eyes full of a cold and unyielding expression. What he said was even more shocking. The Chu kingdom can hold on for another 5 years at most. You have to be prepared to take over the West Camp and that fertile land and the title of nobility. 1 day in the human world was 1 year in the illusionary realm. Sensei went to the Cloud Dream Mountain to play for 5 days. In the world of the Green Sky Mirror, the Grand Secretary Zhang had passed away 5 years ago. The 7 participants in the illusionary realm were already 35 years old. Bai Zhao and Bai Qianjun of the Zhongzhou School, Shi Yun of Yamatsai, Hejan of the Guoqing Temple, and Jing Jiu and Zhuo Ruzhui of the Aoyama sect were all talented disciples of the famous sections. Surprisingly, one of the participants was that free-traveling practitioner named Jiang Rui. The Bluebird would go and take a look at Jiang Rui once in a while. Jiang Rui was still trying his best to climb up the ranks in a county, and it seemed that he had a hard time. He didn't have any power or status, and his cultivation state wasn't very high either. The people couldn't understand why He-Jean would allow this friend who had betrayed him to live until now, considering his current power and ruthlessness in the Zhao kingdom. In comparison to the pitiful Jiang Rui, the other 6 participants played a more important role in the world of the Green Sky Mirror. The White Emperor had finally defeated the barbarians in the north a few times. He had beheaded many of them and captured a great number of war horses, as well as a few fertile grasslands. His prowess in martial arts could be considered unparalleled in the world. The cavalry of the Qin kingdom was like the sharpest weapon. No other kingdom had the power to resist them, save for the Zhao kingdom. The merchants and populace of the Qi kingdom were obviously scared out of their wits. They sped up their overseas expeditions at a furious pace. In 5 years, they had discovered a few large islands and brought back a great amount of rare resources. As a result, they had prepared many routes of retreat while strengthening the strength of the kingdom. It was believed that they would soon discover the rumored alien land. The scholar named Yun Qi had left the education palace to travel and give lectures in the Qi kingdom and the cities under its jurisdiction, and he had even gone overseas to educate the barbarians. As a result, he had gained a high reputation among the populace and had taken on thousands of disciples, including the important figures like the Qi emperor and the ministers of state Zhao kingdom. Those ministers of state Zhao kingdom, who were Yun Qi's disciples, were actually well aware of what they had in mind. They intended to intimidate the imperial court with the help of the glamorous appearance of Yun Qi, but they soon realized their mistake. It was because the intelligence bureau had ruthlessly attacked them in the officialdom and the properties of their clans. Elder He was still the ruler of the Zhao kingdom. All the decrees were issued by him, not by the emperor, nor by the Empress Dowager, who was hiding behind the bead curtain. It was so absurd that the world could not tolerate it. The wise and righteous people of the Zhao kingdom launched waves of attacks again and again, but the eunuch had the loyalty of the generals from all over the kingdom, so he didn't care about these attacks. As for the assassinations carried out by the officials and the merchants of the Qi kingdom, they didn't have any effect. The assassins couldn't even break through the defense of the eunuchs and get to Elder He. As for poisoning, the Intelligence Bureau would never allow such an absurd thing to happen. The only real danger that He-Jean faced was from the man in black who had returned from the west regions. Zhuoruzhui had chosen the perfect place to strike. It was not a county with relatively weak defense, nor was it a busy street in the capital. Instead, it was the Intelligence Bureau. He waited for 7 days on the beam of the cleanest latrine in the Intelligence Bureau, which had a gold-inlaid toilet. He fell asleep 30 times out of boredom and drowsiness. Finally, He-Jean showed up. It was a thrilling battle. The Intelligence Bureau was in a mess, as if a gale had swept through it. More than 20 eunuchs were killed on the spot. Zhuoruzhui had once again proved that he was the most powerful swordsman in the world after Duke Missouri. He-Jean's strange body movements, powerful combat strength, and especially his terrifying willpower in the assassination had once again made the officials of the Zhao kingdom and the merchants of the Qi kingdom feel hopeless. In the end, He-Jean was seriously injured and had disappeared for more than 20 days. Rumor had it that he had been hiding in the Empress Dowager's palace. Zhuoruzhui was also seriously injured. He was almost drowned in the ocean when he was pursued by the Intelligence Bureau and the cavalrymen of the Zhao kingdom. Fortunately, he was rescued by a scholar from the royal palace of the Qi kingdom. It took only 3 days for the news to reach the Chu kingdom, but it took 17 days for it to reach the royal palace and Jingjiu. It was difficult for an emperor who was isolated from the outside world to know what was happening outside the royal palace. Of course, there was nothing he wanted to know. Grand Secretary Zhang had made a lot of preparations before his death. The national treasury and the palace treasury were full. As long as there was no more turmoil in the officialdom, it would be easy for the imperial court to get back on track. After the bloodbath in the Grand Hall, Governor Zhou promoted himself to a Grand Scholar, and Jing Jiu handed the royal seal to him. The other officials were also given important positions. The eldest young Master Zhang was appointed by Jing Jiu to be the chief of Taichung Temple. As for whether this appointment had anything to do with the state duke in Zhaoga City, it was unclear. General Pei was outside, and the Grand Scholar Zhou was inside. The emperor was still not in charge of the affairs of Chu State. The populace of Chu State was living a comfortable life, as if they had returned to the time when the Grand Scholar Zhang was still alive, and another grand event was taking place. However, those who understood the situation could tell that Chu State was on the verge of collapse. This kingdom looked prosperous on the outside, but its internal problems had gradually become evident. The excessive spending, the redundant officials, the corruption, the lax governance, and all kinds of other problems would break out soon. Who would deal with them then? The sad fact was that the Chu kingdom might have already been dealt with before these problems could be dealt with. The first person to target the Chu kingdom was the White Emperor of the Qin kingdom, who had taken it upon himself to conquer the ocean and unify the world. It was on the day when the cavalrymen of the Qin kingdom marched southward that he arrived at the border between the Zhao state and the Chu kingdom. Looking at the fertile fields on the other side of the mountains and the vaguely visible West Camp, he made the famous statement. The West Camp was guarded by General Pei in person. Even though the Qin kingdom had already sent out the army, the imperial court didn't ask him to go to the north. It was to guard against the Zhao state. He Zhan was not in a hurry. No matter how powerful a person was, he would die sooner or later. He could wait. He estimated that the Chu kingdom could hold on for at most 5 years, because General Pei could live for at most 5 years. Everybody seemed to have forgotten that General Pei was only 3 years younger than Grand Secretary Zhang. The Qin kingdom began to attack the Chu kingdom. The strange thing was that the cavalrymen of the Qin kingdom, who were known for their ferocity, were extremely cautious this time. It was unknown whether they were afraid of the hidden strength of the Chu kingdom or worried that the Zhao state would try to take the millet from the fire. They fought steadily and surely. They even took the initiative to withdraw at the end of spring. It took them 4 years to advance 300 miles southward. Jingju didn't care about the affairs of the world. But if he wanted to cultivate in the imperial palace, he had to pay attention to this matter. Every once in a while, he would read the summary of the military information presented by the imperial court. From the information, he drew an interesting conclusion. The Qin army seemed to maintain a certain rhythm. It was this rhythm that effectively controlled the attack of the Qin army and ensured that the war would not go out of control. It was obvious that the upper echelons of the Qin kingdom wanted an intact Chu kingdom, not a broken Chu kingdom. Only in this way could they, after conquering the Chu kingdom, completely digest the national and military strength of the Chu kingdom in the shortest time possible and gain an absolute advantage in the final war against the Zhao state. The problem was that it wasn't something an ordinary person could do to make hundreds of thousands of cavalrymen act according to a certain rhythm. It required extremely brilliant leadership, planning, and meticulous operation. The White Emperor's art of war was godly, but he was too violent and bloodthirsty. He shouldn't be able to do such a thing. He sensed that it should be by Zeus' doing. There was no such thing as a princess in distress who was imprisoned in the palace. There was only the person in power behind the scenes in the Qin kingdom, just like he was in the Chu kingdom. After confirming that the entire strategy was made by Zeo, Jingjiu was even more certain of what the Qin kingdom wanted to do. Unfortunately, he couldn't change it. In the winter of the 4th year of the war between Qin and Chu, on an ordinary day, General Pei closed his eyes in his tent and left with Grand Secretary Zhang. This news was like a fire, igniting the wild grass that had been growing crazily in the wilderness for 4 years. Those wild grass were ambitious. The 70,000 cavalrymen of the Qin kingdom left Sangzhou and headed south. They didn't care about the loss of their troops and the harassment of the Chu kingdom along the way. They charged almost crazily toward the capital of the Chu kingdom. Chapter 397. The death of General Pei directly changed the situation of the world. The cavalry of the Qin kingdom broke through several defenses of the Chu kingdom's army and soon passed Baihe County. The capital was in sight. The reason why the army could advance so smoothly was that the Qin army was too powerful and the Chu army was not strong enough. There was another important reason. The vanguard of the Qin army was the army of Jing of Silla. They knew the Chu kingdom too well and hated the imperial court. Under the silent attack of Zhao State, the West camp didn't hold on for too long. The elite army that had been through hundreds of battles had lost its backbone. The speed of its collapse was faster than what everybody, including He Zhan and the generals of Zhao State, had imagined. As the remnants of Chu State fled and retreated, the white banners of General Pei's death were still hung up in the camp. Whether from Baihe County or the West Camp to the capital of the Chu kingdom, it was a vast plain. The land was fertile, but there was no danger. The Chu kingdom had lost its power. The news of the war kept coming back to the capital. The air was filled with tension and despair. The people stood on the street and read the notices, numb and confused. The officials in the court and the ministries looked away, not knowing where they were looking. The scholars of the academy were no longer in high spirits. They held their scrolls and looked into the distance in a daze. No one knew what they were thinking. The business of the brothels became very good. Every night, the buildings on the banks of the rivers and lakes were brightly lit and full. At the moment of the survival of the nation, in the face of sorrow and despair, they could only drink every night and live a befuddled life. It seemed to be understandable for the Chu people. The blue bird flew over the night sky of the capital and looked down at these strange scenes and people. It landed in the deepest part of the imperial palace. There were no lights in the hall. It was very dark. One could clearly see the lights outside the imperial palace in the night sky. The blue bird walked to the end of the wide couch and looked into Jingju's eyes. "You don't have time." Jingju uttered saying nothing. If there were no Qin, Zhao, Qi and the other countries, the Chu people could live well, but with strong enemies there would be problems. If the grand scholar Zhang were still alive, this day might come a little later. But he was dead, and now even General Pei was dead. No one could control life and death, not even Jingju. Even in the real world outside the green sky mirror, all he could do was try his best to control his own life and death, but he couldn't affect others. The Jing family in Zhaoga City, like the Lu couple in the small village, would die one day. The blue bird looked into his eyes in silence, and did not turn into a little girl. Soon, it would leave again to witness the magnificent scene of the army of the Qin kingdom marching south on behalf of the cultivators in the outside world. Jingju was silent for a while. He flicked his finger and the oil lamp on the pillar was lit. A moment later, the sound of footsteps came from outside the hall. The young eunuch was kneeling on the ground, waiting for orders. Jingju said, "Tell the people outside the palace that I will attend the court meeting tomorrow." It wasn't even dawn yet. It was pitch black in the sky, except for the remnants of the joyful and despairing lights. The sound of wheels rolling over the green stone slabs could be heard on the road. Many carriages came from the south of the city and gathered on the straight road in front of the royal palace. Some carriages stopped, and the officials pulled up the curtains and stared at each other speechlessly, or discussed in a low voice, guessing each other's thoughts and, more importantly, the emperor's thoughts. In fact, under the current circumstances, many officials, including the scholars and populace, had the same thought: to surrender. Under the attack of Qin and Zhao, the Chu kingdom couldn't hold on any longer, not to mention that the West camp, which was their last stronghold, was gone. The White Emperor was extremely cruel, and eunuch he was cold and perverted. If the Chu kingdom really persisted and angered these two, it would probably lead to a scene of rivers of blood, and even a massacre of the entire city might happen. At the moment, the vanguard of the Qin kingdom was Jing of Silla's army, and many of them were Chu people. It was better to surrender to them than to the foreigners. Jing of Silla and his subordinates couldn't be too extreme. The Qin kingdom even had to help the Chu people block the Zhao light cavalry of the West camp, if they still wanted to unify the world. No matter how one looked at it, surrender was the only choice for the Chu kingdom, and the sooner they surrendered, the better the result would be. This thought lingered in the minds of all the officials and couldn't be erased. But they didn't tell their colleagues or their friends. Even the people closest to them didn't know what they were thinking. It was because whoever proposed to surrender first would be the greatest sinner in the history of the Chu kingdom. Nobody was willing to die with such a reputation. It was better to die in the wine vat in the brothel. The most important issue was what to do with the emperor. Negotiating with Jing of Silla to surrender was the best choice for the Chu kingdom, but Jing of Silla would definitely kill the emperor to avenge his son. With all kinds of thoughts and guesses about the emperor's mind, the officials walked into the royal palace silently like the suffocating fishes, lining up in 2 rows in the grand hall. Sitting on the highest throne was a man wearing a bright yellow royal robe. His black hair was tied up behind his head with a cloth band, exposing his handsome face. They hadn't seen this scene for a long time, reminding some chancellors of the bloody rebellion in the palace 5 years ago. Some of them looked pale because of fear, and some of them felt hopeful, their pale faces flushed. The grand scholar Zhou was one of them, who hadn't been home for 50 days because of the state affairs and the wars. Jing Jiu's gaze swept over the faces of the officials. He saw the fear in their eyes, which came from the officials of the Ministry of War who were afraid of being appointed. He saw the excitement in their eyes, which came from the officials of the royal censor who thought he was going to lead the army in person. He also saw the fear in their eyes, which came from those people who had evil intentions and were afraid that the bloody events would happen again. Most of all, he saw the numbness and the boredom after they had accepted their fate in despair. It was deathly quiet in the grand hall until Jingjiu said, "Draw up the decree. This emperor approves it." The chancellors were startled. They eyed each other speechlessly, not understanding what the emperor meant. What decree was he going to draw up? What was he going to approve? "We can negotiate however we want, but not with Sangzhou. Let the messenger from Xianyang come here." Having said this, Jingjiu got up from the throne and left the grand hall. It was deathly quiet in the grand hall. The officials didn't realize what they had heard until the figure in bright yellow had disappeared in the deep end of the grand hall. Did the emperor mean surrender? The officials were stunned speechless, feeling complicated emotions. They eyed each other, not knowing what to do. The grand scholar Zhou sighed, his eyes full of pain and remorse. He felt that he had failed Grand Secretary Zhang and the populace of Chu Kingdom, and that he had put the emperor in such a difficult situation. It was even more unforgivable for him to die 10,000 times. He was fully aware why the emperor called for a court meeting and made such a declaration to the chancellors of the imperial court. The Chu Kingdom would be defeated for sure. Surrendering was the best choice, but none of the chancellors dared make such a decision. Like those stories in history, everybody knew that the chancellors and populace could surrender when 2 states were at war, but the emperors couldn't. The emperor proposed surrendering voluntarily because he didn't want the chancellors of the imperial court to shoulder the responsibility of history and solve the current chaotic situation as soon as possible. This was a wise and clear-cut decision, but which emperor would be willing to make such a decision? What the grand scholar Zhou could think of, those smart officials of the imperial court couldn't think of. After a long moment of silence, a few cries suddenly broke out in the grand hall. Even those officials who weren't crying had red eyes, their faces full of regret and pain, though it was hard to tell if it was true or not. The chief of Taichung Temple abruptly turned around and stared at these useless officials, yelling sternly, "Come on! His Majesty is still alive." The mother of the eldest young Master Zhang had passed away 4 years ago. He was an old man now, with silver hair on his head, but he looked much more awe-inspiring than before, even resembling the style of his father. Hearing his stern yell, the cries in the grand hall had finally stopped. The chancellors came back to their senses and looked at the grand scholar Zhou in tandem. The lips of the grand scholar Zhou trembled a few times, and he squeezed out a sentence with difficulty: "Negotiate peace with the Qin state. All the royal army will be mobilized in the direction of the West camp." Then, he stared at those officials sternly and said in a cold voice, "Nobody is allowed to talk about this outside. Don't tell me that you can't conceal it. Conceal it for as long as you can. Do you hear me?" A delegation of the Qin kingdom entered the capital of the Chu kingdom secretly. According to the request of the Chu kingdom, Jing Silla didn't show up, but there were many people from Tsangzhou in the delegation. Some officials of the imperial court had many ideas. They tried their best to get acquainted with those people, whether they were of the same age or from the same hometown, in order to protect themselves, and they even hoped to get a better position in the new imperial court. Those people from Tsangzhou had been the officials of the Chu kingdom, but they were the officials chosen by the Crown Prince Jing Tongyen herself. They met the officials of the imperial court with an insincere smile. Only when their gazes fell on the royal palace would they show a hint of coldness and hatred. No matter how secretive the delegation was, it was impossible to conceal it from everybody. The news had spread out in the capital, and a storm had arisen. The grand scholar Zhou, who was known for his benevolence, finally showed some of the courage of the Grand Secretary Zhang back then. He killed 3 chancellors forcefully to stabilize the situation for the time being. The so-called negotiation of peace was a surrender. The Chu kingdom didn't have much confidence, and the Qin kingdom was pressing forward. It was hard to settle the negotiation in a short time. However, both sides knew that the emperor of the Chu kingdom had to abdicate the throne without any negotiation. The sky couldn't have 2 suns, and the country couldn't have 2 rulers. If the White Emperor wanted to be the ruler of the world, he wouldn't allow Jingjiu to sit on the throne. The best outcome for Jingjiu was to obtain the nominal title of king and be guarded by a large number of soldiers. When the populace of the Chu kingdom had gradually forgotten him, he would be slowly poisoned to death, starved to death, or accidentally drowned in the water, like his father. It was then that a decree suddenly came out from the deep end of the royal palace. The emperor wanted to have a talk with the delegation of the Qin kingdom in person. As soon as the decree came out, many officials and those people from Tsangzhou in the delegation of the Qin kingdom felt disdainful, wondering what kind of terms the emperor of the Qin kingdom, who had lost his kingdom, would ask for at this moment. A bigger manor house or a room full of fine wine, or a 16-year-old concubine and a room full of good wine. One early morning, a few officials of the delegation of the Qin kingdom entered the royal palace and came to the tranquil grand hall. Jingjiu waved his hand, motioning for all the eunuchs and palace maids to leave. The officials of the Qin kingdom thought of some rumors, and their expressions changed slightly. Then they thought, even if you kill all of us, what use will it be? At this moment, an ordinary-looking official of the Qin kingdom suddenly said, "All of you leave first." The officials of the Qin kingdom looked a little uneasy, but they didn't dare to oppose and left the grand hall as they were told. Jingjiu looked at the official of the Qin kingdom and said, "I didn't expect it to be you." The official of the Qin kingdom raised her head and removed her disguise, revealing a beautiful and pleasant face. She smiled sweetly at him. "If I hadn't come this time, I probably wouldn't have seen you again. It's over." A voice suddenly came from behind the pillar. This time, it was no longer lazy, but rather exasperated. Zhuoruzhui walked out and looked at Jingjiu angrily. "Since it's her who has come, then hurry up and pack your bags. Let's go." Chapter 398. Two readers have guessed the title of this chapter, and then, what else can I do? I can only write it like this. I turned around silently. The official from the Qin kingdom was a woman. She was in high spirits, and her eyes were bright. She had a natural beauty about her. She was able to drive all the officials of the Qin kingdom out of the palace with a single word, especially those from Sangzhou. Her status in Xianyang was naturally very high, and she was acquainted with Tong Yen. This confirmed her identity. Of course, she had never thought of concealing her identity from Jingjiu. Otherwise, she would not have taken the risk to come here. Seeing Zhuoruzhui flash out from behind the pillar, Bai Zhao tilted his head slightly and asked in confusion, "What are you doing here?" Zhuoruzhui said listlessly, "I can't do anything now." Thinking of Zhuoruzhui's words, she vaguely guessed something. She looked at Jingjiu uncertainly and asked, "Are you waiting for him?" "Yes," Jingjiu answered. Bai Zhao was very confused, saying, "He is the emperor of the Qin kingdom. Now that the Chu kingdom is powerless to resist, why would he take the risk to come here?" Jingjiu said, "Your big brother is a very proud person. He should be very happy to come here and see how I look when I surrender." Bai Zhao shook his head and said, "Being proud doesn't mean that he will get carried away." Jingjiu said, "According to my calculation, he may not get carried away, but he will get carried away." There was obviously a deeper meaning in this statement. After a moment of silence, Bai Zhao asked, "How did you guess?" Jingjiu said, "Calculating is not guessing." Bai Zhao looked him in the eyes and said, "But in the end, you still got it wrong." Beside him, Zhuoruzhui nodded vigorously. Jingjiu said, "If you don't come, he will. Of course, this is not absolute." Bai Zhao recalled his quarrel with his senior brother in the palace of Xianyang. After a moment of silence, he said, "If he comes, what do you want to do?" Zhuoruzhui was baffled and said, "Are you going to treat him to a meal?" "Kill him, of course." Bai Zhao glanced at him and said, "Are you sure you can kill him?" "I'm very strong." Zhuoruzhui said, "Moreover, this is not Xianyang. He does not have the 3,000 soldiers to protect him. He will die for sure." He did not mention a certain person, but both he and Bai Zhao knew that Jingjiu was also very strong. Bai Zhao said, "Now that I'm here, you can kill me. If she were just an unfortunate princess of the previous dynasty, it would be meaningless to kill her. But if she were just an ordinary princess, why would the officials of the Qin kingdom listen to her?" Jingjiu had long guessed that the Qin kingdom's plans in the world must have originated from her and Tong Yan's plans. In recent years, the Qin kingdom's strategy of invading the south must have been arranged by her. Her status and role in the Qin kingdom were very important. Therefore, killing her or using her to threaten the White Emperor would be meaningful for the Chu kingdom. But he did not say anything, nor did he make a move. "As I said at the beginning, since it's you who came, it's over," Zhuoruzhui said angrily. "Although I'm in seclusion on the top of Tianguang Peak, I know the relationship between you. Why would he kill you?" Whether it was a young lady in a boudoir or a fairy-like cultivation practitioner, when they heard this kind of talk, they would feel displeased or ashamed. But Bai Zhao was delighted. He secretly gave Zhuoruzhui a thumbs up to show his appreciation. Looking at the scallion finger, Zhuoruzhui felt even more helpless. He turned to Jingjiu and said, "All these years I've been killing people outside, and you've been in power in the Chu kingdom. 2 against 2. It seems very promising. But now your kingdom is going to be destroyed, and I'm getting old here. What should I do next?" Jingjiu thought about it and said, "I haven't decided yet." Zhuoruzhui said, "Now it seems that your plan is wrong. At least there's not enough time to prove it. I have to do it my own way." Having said that, he turned around and walked out of the hall. The breeze ruffled his empty sleeves and hair, and there were several strands of white hair in them. Zhuoruzhui's figure disappeared in the morning light. The hall was quiet for a moment. Baizao walked to the front of Jingjiu and asked, while staring into his eyes, "What did he mean by plan?" "You're so smart that you should be able to guess it," said Jingjiu. "The people who understood you the most were not your lovers or your enemies, but those who were qualified to be your opponent. In the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror, the person who had guessed Jingjiu's plan and had the ability to stop him from carrying it out was Tong Yen. Back then, Jingjiu would rather give Sangzhou to the Qin kingdom to kill Tong Yen, because he wanted to gain more time. He had fought for 10 years, but unfortunately, he didn't succeed. "Do you intend to break through the cultivation state here?" Baizao exclaimed with an incredulous expression. Jingjiu turned around and walked to the back of the hall without saying a word. Following behind Jingjiu, Baizao said, "It's impossible. Even though you're an unparalleled genius and don't want to follow the normal path, the rules are still the rules." Jingjiu still didn't say anything. He came to the bedroom, took off the hairband, sat on the bed, and took out a few pieces of paper. His black hair spread out like a waterfall, forming a sharp contrast with the snow-like white paper. Seeing this scene, Baizao smiled faintly and sat on the bed, saying, "No matter what you think, I've won." "Not necessarily," Jingjiu said calmly while staring at her eyes. Baizao felt his face was a bit hot, but he didn't avert his eyes bravely. Many years ago, he and Baizao met on this bed when they were 2 or 3 years old. Now that they were grown up, this bed became much smaller. They were right in front of each other, and they were indeed very close. Jingjiu handed over the paper in his hand and said, "My conditions." Baizao didn't take the paper, but looked at Jingjiu's face. Suppressing her embarrassment, she said, "It's all up to you." She wasn't showing off her leniency as a victor, but she knew that Jingjiu would naturally decide to surrender and wouldn't put forward too harsh conditions. She explained it to herself in this way. The blue bird on the branch outside the window had already turned its head to look into the distance. In an inconspicuous storeroom of a trading house, Zhuoruzhui was cutting his hair. He twisted his hair into a very messy and short haircut, and then he began to carefully install an iron arm on himself. The peace talk soon ended, because the Qin kingdom had agreed to most of the conditions of the Chu kingdom. But since it was a surrender, those conditions were only minor details. The name of the kingdom would definitely be changed, and the army would definitely be reorganized. The capital of the Chu kingdom would be changed to the southern part, guarded by the Zhangzhou army. Jing of Silla would be conferred the title of King of the South, and he might live in the royal palace. The real benefits for the Chu kingdom were in taxes, laws, jurisdiction, and so on. In other words, all the benefits belonged to the people. Given the ruthlessness of the White Emperor, it was not easy for the negotiation to reach such a result. But when the result of the negotiation began to spread in the capital of the Chu kingdom and beyond, it still caused a great disturbance. It was because the collapse of the kingdom was a humiliation and pain that few people could bear. Jingjiu, who was conferred the title of King of Linshan, became the symbol of humiliation and was laughed at by the world. The capital of the Chu kingdom was filled with cries and curses. All the scholars and talents began to display their talents to their heart's content, writing poems to describe the sorrow of the collapse of the kingdom and their anger at the incompetent and muddle-headed emperor. Perhaps even they themselves didn't realize that there was a certain feeling of relief hidden behind those poems. The Flowing Cloud House was the most popular brothel in the capital of the Chu kingdom, and Miss Yiyun was the most popular girl in the Flowing Cloud House. Those who could let her stay with them must be the richest or the most powerful playboys. Tonight, she was accompanying the young prince of the Prince Cheng's mansion. The young prince drank a lot of wine, and in his drunkenness, he commented on the affairs of the court for half the night. He spent 80% of his time criticizing the emperor for being muddle-headed and incompetent, and for handing over the great state left by his ancestors to others. In the past, even though the emperor had always been known as an idiot and lived in seclusion in the palace, No one dared to criticize him like this. But the situation was different now. Everyone knew that the Chu kingdom was about to collapse, and the emperor would probably live only a few years. No one would care about these trivial things. Before the young prince passed out, he didn't forget to mention the relationship between his family and the Jing of Silla. The princes and nobles in the capital were all relatives of the Jing of Silla. But according to the young prince's proud statement, his father, the Prince Qing, was a good brother of the Jing of Silla, and they were very close friends. Even after the Jing of Silla betrayed the Qin kingdom, they didn't cut off contact. In the future, there would definitely be a place for him in the new Qin kingdom. Miss Yi Yun looked at the sleeping young prince in silence for a long time. Suddenly, she took out a small knife and cut his neck. Then, she took out a writing brush, dipped it in his blood, and wrote a short poem. That poem described the pain of the subjugation of the country and her hatred for the civil and military officials in the imperial court and the emperor of Chu. One of the lines in the poem was, "Not a single man." The young prince was killed by a prostitute. Even when the country was destroyed and the world turned upside down, it was still a major event that shook the capital. Miss Yi Yun was imprisoned. Even if that poem, especially that line, quickly spread in the capital, she couldn't escape the fate of being executed by 1,000 cuts. At this moment, a eunuch quietly entered the prison and brought her out. The eunuch took her in a carriage and left the capital overnight. After traveling for several days and nights, they arrived outside the West Barracks and joined the Zhao army. The carriage was sent directly to the central military tent. Wearing a black cloak, Eunuch Hejan walked to the front of the carriage and lifted the curtain. Looking at the prostitute with a pale face and picturesque eyebrows, he frowned and said nothing. These were all trivial matters. The subjugation of the Chu kingdom was a major event. Jing Jiu was originally a famous idiot emperor. Now, he had confirmed his identity as a fatuous emperor. Of course, he couldn't get rid of the title of the subjugation of the country. The people of Chu were good at writing. Suddenly, countless poems and songs appeared to denounce him. The words in those poems were marvelous and impassioned. Even the distant education palace of the Qi kingdom had written a few poems denouncing his wrongdoings and alluding to what had happened to Zhao. Surprisingly, Mr. Yun Qi didn't think so. On the contrary, he gave the emperor of Chu a high evaluation. It could even be said that he praised him highly. The delegation of the Qin kingdom had returned to Xianyang in secret. Dozens of days later, accompanied by the autumn rain, Jingju Silla led the army of the Qin kingdom to the outside of the capital of the Chu kingdom, ready to take over the government officially. It was then that the people outside the capital suddenly found a band of black smoke rising up in the city, which should be in the direction of the royal palace. The grand scholar Zhou passed out after seeing the black smoke in front of his eyes. Jingju Silla narrowed his eyes, reflecting on something. Chapter 399. Countless people swarmed into the royal palace, but they couldn't do anything while looking at the palace hall engulfed by the flames. It was useless even if a rainstorm came down from the sky. The eunuchs and the palace servant girls stood around in a daze. Some of them had already cried bitterly, and a few eunuchs looked bewildered, thinking that they were good at washing the blood left by the emperor in this palace hall. Now that the palace hall had been burned down and the emperor had passed away, what else could they do? The fire was so big that it was impossible to put it out. It didn't die down until 3 days and 3 nights later. The soldiers rushed into the ruins to search for the emperor, but they found that the gold and silver inlaid on the beams had all been melted into solidified lava. It was impossible to find the corpse of the Chu emperor. Overnight, many residential houses were hung up with white banners, and the whole capital looked like it was covered with a snowfall. After the White Emperor learned of the matter, he ordered the emperor to be buried with the honors of a king. The grand scholar Zhou was seriously ill. He resigned as soon as he recovered, and his whereabouts were unknown. The chief of Taichung Temple had already brought the entire clan of the former Grand Scholar Manor back to their hometown. Nobody had the heart to criticize the emperor for his incompetence and cowardice anymore. The king had died for the state. What more could they ask of him? Many populace had gradually recalled the situation when the emperor and the Grand Secretary Zhang were in power, and they felt nostalgic about it. How many emperors could be like the emperor who never went out of the palace and never caused trouble? Nostalgia for the past often meant dissatisfaction with the present. Nobody was willing to accept the brutal and forceful rule of the Qin kingdom. Many scholars changed the direction of their writing and wrote many sad poems to mourn the passing of the emperor in the fire. Many populace insisted that the emperor didn't die in the first place, and that he had escaped by taking advantage of the fire. He was living in seclusion in some place, either as a monk, or plotting how to recover the former state. The palace halls in Xianying City were all black. Set off by Aoyama in the distance, the palace looked quite desolate. It was soundless around the grand hall. Those soldiers in black armor holding the long spears seemed to be not breathing, which made the people feel intimidated. There was a patch of white in the grand hall, which was the most powerful man in the world, the White Emperor. Bai Zhao came to the palace hall. Naturally, there were many colors because she was also wearing a white dress. You know he's not dead, so why did you come back? Bai Qianjun stared into her eyes and asked. Bai Zhao looked back at him calmly and said, "Are you questioning me?" Bai Qianjun put his hand on his forehead and said, "My apologies, I am a little tired from managing the affairs of the state." A few years ago, he had said that he wanted to forget some things. Bai Zhao remembered. His eyelids drooped slightly, but his long eyelashes did not tremble. Bai Qianjun said, "We can't let him slip away like this. We must find his whereabouts and confirm whether he's dead or alive. Capture all the eunuchs and palace maids in the imperial palace of the Chu kingdom, as well as those high-ranking officials. We will definitely get something by torturing them. We don't believe that he didn't leave any traces behind." "This is inappropriate," Bai Zhao said. "Since the general situation has been decided, there is no need to care about these minor details, which will only cause more trouble." Bai Qianjun said, "Even though Yun Qi's reputation is high, it's useless to talk like a scholar, so we don't need to pay attention to him. Eunuch he is indeed difficult to deal with, but he is still a eunuch. When Zhao Huang grows up, Zhao will definitely run into trouble. All we need to do is wait. As for the Chu Emperor, you have said many times that we should pay attention to him. Why is it that he is not considered the general situation now?" Bai Zhao said, "An emperor without a state is like a duckweed without roots. No matter how strong the wind is, it can only go with the flow. How can one person shake the world?" After a moment of silence, Bai Qian said, "What you said makes sense. I'm going to rest now." Bai Zhao walked toward the outside of the palace hall. Outside the palace hall, Eunuch Gao saw her and hurriedly knelt down to pay his respect. She didn't even glance at him, nor did she pay any attention to those stern and powerful soldiers outside the palace hall. Arriving before the stone steps, she suddenly halted her steps, as if she had thought of something. She didn't turn around, but continued walking down the steps. Eunuch Gao came to the deep end of the black hall and knelt before the emperor, holding up a list of names with both hands. Bai Qianjun took the list and skimmed through it. His face darkened slightly. It was obvious that he was dissatisfied. "We can basically confirm that the Emperor of Chu didn't escape with the diplomatic group, but there are many things that we can't ask in detail." Eunuch Gao lowered his head as he spoke, his voice trembling slightly. As the chief supervisor of the royal palace of Xianying, he was one of the few people who knew the real status of the princess in the Qin kingdom and her influence on the emperor. Eunuch Gao didn't dare offend the princess, so it was inconvenient for him to use tricks on the members of the diplomatic group. Bai Qianjun said in a slightly cold voice, Bring all the members of the diplomatic group to the side hall. I want to see you interrogate them in person. The side hall was also completely black, and there was less light in it, making it appear even more gloomy. The officials and caretakers of the diplomatic group were escorted into the hall in turn to be interrogated by Eunuch Gao. They didn't notice the emperor sitting in the deep end of the hall. After the interrogation of those officials and caretakers, they still didn't find any problems. Next, it was the turn of the few managers of the trading companies. The diplomatic group of the Qin Kingdom had secretly entered the Chu capital in the name of a trading company, so they had recruited a few managers to assist them. A manager of the trading company came into the side hall and walked up to Eunuch Gao. He bowed slightly, seemingly preparing to salute. In the deep end of the hall, Bai Qianjun, who was pretending to be asleep in the shadows, suddenly opened his eyes and looked at that person. The manager of the trading company looked somewhat thin, but the sound of his footsteps landing on the floor indicated that he was heavier than he looked. Bai Qianjun didn't have time to think about it, yelling, "Stop him!" Eunuch Gao's expression changed abruptly, blocking in front of the manager of the trading company without hesitation. The manager of the trading company bowed slightly. He wasn't preparing to salute, but rather was gathering his strength, like a stiff bow that was gradually being pulled back. His feet stomped heavily on the floor, creating several cracks on the floor. His whole body shot out like an arrow released from a bow. Eunuch Gao was a highly skilled swordsman in the Xianyang royal palace, but before the thunderous power of the other party, he had no way to fight back. His face showed a look of terror. With a ripping sound, his body disappeared, turning into blood, flesh, and pieces of clothing that flew in the air. A flying sword pierced through the rain of blood, instantly arriving in front of Bai Qianjun. Bai Qianjun let out a shrill cry, his arms crossed together, the ritual implement on his wrist emitting a murderous aura, blocking the flying sword. The sharp blade of the sword and the ritual implement clashed, creating countless sparks. On the other side of the sparks, a figure could be faintly seen, pouncing over like a fierce tiger. Bai Qianjun fell to the ground. An extremely thick iron plate fell from the top of the hall, smashing heavily on the ground, sending up countless clouds of dust and making a loud noise. The iron plate had turned into an impassable iron door. A dozen highly skilled swordsmen of the Qin army had already arrived in front of Bai Qianjun, raising their iron shields, protecting him impenetrably. The two powerful layers of defense finally put Bai Qianjun at ease, his face showing an expression of anger and humiliation. Suddenly, his expression changed again, because the assassin who had controlled the sword to kill had already arrived in front of the iron door. The iron door was over 2 inches thick, and even a siege crossbow could not penetrate it. Logically speaking, he should not be worried, but for some reason, he still felt uneasy, and subconsciously took 2 steps back. A loud bang resounded. It was as if a thunderbolt that should have been high up in the sky had exploded in the hall, or as if 2 iron hammers weighing tens of thousands of pounds had collided head-on. Air billowed and spewed in the side hall, and smoke and dust rose. The highly skilled swordsmen of the Qin army with their iron shields were all knocked to the ground, blood spurting wildly. More than half of them had died. Bai Qianjun was protected very tightly, but he was still affected. Covered in blood, he was supported by the swordsmen of the Qin army who had once again arrived, and retreated to the back. Dozens of highly skilled swordsmen of the Qin army had set up layer after layer of shield formations in front of him, and countless arrows were aimed at the smoke and dust. As the smoke and dust settled, the scene in the hall gradually became clearer. Only then did people realize that a large hole had been blasted through the iron gate. There was a person standing on the other side of the smoke and dust. His head was lowered and he looked weak. His left sleeve had already been completely shredded, revealing a severely deformed iron arm. His messy hair danced in the wind, and a few strands of white hair could be vaguely seen. It was Zhuoruzhui. He had killed the highly achieved swordsman of the royal court of the Qin kingdom with one sword strike, punched through an iron plate with one fist strike, killed a dozen swordsmen of the Qin army, and wounded the Qin emperor severely. Such combat prowess was indeed formidable. Of course, he had paid a great price for it. His chest was covered with blood stains, and he looked weak not because he was tired, but because he was exhausted. More masters of the Qin kingdom rushed over. They directly tore down a corner of the side hall and erected countless iron shields, but no one dared to step forward. Bai Qianjun was helped up. He looked at Zhuoruzhui through the shield formation and thought with a pale face that Zhuoruzhui was indeed a little monster of the Aoyama sect. He was so powerful even in the dreamland. It took him less than 40 years to reach the state of free travel. It was well known that the free travel or the initial yuanying were the upper limit of the cultivation states in the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror. Even if you are powerful, so what? He said to Zhuoruzhui, you will still die today. Zhuoruzhui lifted his head slowly and stared into his eyes, saying, don't talk nonsense. Let's fight one-on-one if you dare. Bai Qianjun said in a mocking tone, this is a fight for the hegemony of the world. It's not a fight of bravery and ruthlessness. It's the behavior of a fool to try to fight against an entire state alone. Zhuoruzhui said, you are the representative of the center state, but you have been forced by the disciples of the Aoyama sect to hide in a turtle shell for the rest of your life. Aren't you afraid of losing face? Bai Qianjun sneered. You are a fool, but do you think I am one as well? No sooner had he said this than the arrows shot out like a rainstorm. Hundreds of highly achieved swordsmen of the Qin army leaped forward fearlessly, drowning Zhuoruzhui like the tide. The tide looked terrifying, but it was very difficult for it to swallow the reef in an instant. Zhuoruzhui was like a reef. The tide slapped on his body and turned into bloody bubbles. Occasionally, he would disappear, but he would reappear in the end. This bloody and cruel siege lasted for half a day. The hall was filled with corpses and broken crossbow arrows. The Qin kingdom paid the price of more than 100 highly achieved swordsmen, and Zhuoruzhui was finally unable to hold on. It's not that I can't hold on, I'm just a little tired. I haven't slept well these days. Zhuoruzhui sat on the ground, coughing as he spoke. With every cough, some of the blood on his body would splash out, making him look very bloody. Bai Qianjun looked at him and said mockingly, you really think of yourself as an assassin. Even if you still remember what happened outside, you still lost your way. Zhuoruzhui said, what I did is not a big deal. But since you really think of yourself as an emperor, you are destined to have no future. Bai Qianjun said sternly, the cultivation of the Aoyama sect only depends on the individual, but our Zhongzhou school is willing to lead the human race forward. This is the true leader. History will prove which is the true path, both here and in the outside world. Zhuoruzhui said, if the green sky mirror hadn't limited the upper limit of the cultivation state, I would have killed you a long time ago. Are you going to lead the underworld forward? Bai Qianjun sneered. Do you think you can do whatever you want just because you have a higher cultivation state? Do you think you can command the swordsman? If we were in the outside world, I would be able to kill whoever I want after I reached the upper state of the heavenly arrival state. Otherwise, why didn't the leader of your Zhongzhou school go and kill Jian Shilai? Zhuoruzhui spat out a mouthful of bloody saliva in front of him and asked tiredly, are you an idiot to ask such a question? The expression on Bai Qianjun's face changed slightly, but he suppressed his anger and asked, tell me, where is Jingjiu? Zhuoruzhui felt even more baffled as he exclaimed, are you really an idiot to ask me this question? Having said that, he slapped his palm down on his head and died. Then, he opened his eyes by the green sky mirror and woke up. It was dusk. The bright red rays of the setting sun shone on the slowly rotating green sky mirror, making the rivers look like blood. The gazes of a dozen participants in the Tao competition fell on him, showing a hint of awe and hatred. In that world, Zhuoruzhui had killed the most people, and his prowess was the most formidable, and he died the most valiantly. Zhuoruzhui didn't pay any attention to these gazes. He remained silent for a while looking at the bloody rivers and the red mountain in the green sky mirror, reflecting on something. He didn't express any of his feelings in the end, perhaps because he was reluctant to part with them, or regretful. He stood up and walked toward the outside of the cave while holding his waist, complaining incessantly. Chapter 400. The cultivation practitioners in the real world had all witnessed the bloody battle in the royal palace of Xianyang. They didn't miss any details, including the last conversation between Bai Qianjun and Zhuoruzhui. Seeing the corpses all over the ground and Zhuoruzhui sitting among them, it was quiet outside the Huin Valley for a long time. The cultivation practitioners pondered the conversation in silence, and the more they thought it made sense. The Zhongzhou school and the Aoyama sect were the leaders of the orthodox cultivation circle, but their styles of doing things were completely different. The Zhongzhou school focused on getting involved in the affairs of the human world. They tried to influence every corner of the human world through the imperial court, the officials and the army, in an attempt to lead the human race forward. On the other hand, the Aoyama sect didn't care about the affairs of the human world. They wouldn't strike until it was necessary, like sending the disciples of Liangwang Peak out to slay the demons and assassins. The disciples of the two sects acted according to this custom in the world of the green sky mirror. The so-called illusionary realm was not so different from the real world. Many people felt the significance of the illusionary realm, and they were even more curious about which side would win the Tao competition and obtain the precious fairy book of longevity. After Zhuoruzhui left the illusionary realm, Jingjiu was still in the illusionary realm. After the fire, the people in the illusionary realm were guessing whether Jingjiu was dead or alive, and the people in the real world knew that he was still alive. Jingjiu, who was sitting by the green sky mirror, hadn't woken up yet, the glass bell hanging behind him in silence. Yet nobody knew where Jingjiu was. The blue bird hadn't found any trace of Jingjiu for a long time, which was truly shocking. The royal palace of the Chu kingdom had one more ruin and one less emperor. As such, the blue bird wouldn't stay here any longer. The Qin kingdom had entered a long period of steady development after the death of the assassin of the man in black. The merchants of the Qi kingdom had opened up a few new sea routes. Their enthusiasm for the alien land led to a great expansion of the ocean. Unfortunately, the cultivation practitioners were not interested in this kind of thing, and they were not interested in the debate in the Academy of the Qi kingdom and Mr. Yunqi either. As such, Jingjiu stayed in the Zhao kingdom most of the time. Zhao's court situation seemed to be stable, but it was actually very unpredictable. Just as Bai Qianjun expected, Zhao's little emperor would eventually grow up, and the plot would naturally become interesting. In the past 5 years, the young son of heaven had become a young man and was gradually approaching adulthood. His performance was very outstanding. He was extremely filial and obedient to the Empress Dowager, and anyone could tell that it was from the bottom of his heart. There was absolutely no falsehood. He was also very respectful to Elder He and treated him as an elder. Perhaps it was because of these reasons that Elder He and the Empress Dowager gradually relaxed their restrictions on the young emperor. He had more and more opportunities to interact with the court officials and scholars. He even had a vague idea of forming his own team. Logically speaking, at least Elder He should have been vigilant against such movements, but for some reason, he didn't care about this at all. He led the Tiki and his subordinates to patrol the various states and counties all year round, or to be more accurate, to go on sightseeing tours. The rule that eunuchs were not allowed to leave the capital was completely meaningless to him. While enjoying the scenery, eunuch, he also did some things along the way. For example, supervising the irrigation works, dealing with the livelihood of the people, arranging military defense, punishing officials, bullying men and robbing treasures, making money wantonly. Although the people were not boiling with resentment, it was inevitable that there would be gossip. It was not until General Pei of the Chu kingdom died of illness, and the 7 groups of light cavalry of Zhao besieged the west camp and won the battle, that the whole world knew that elder he had been planning for the past 5 years. Yes, the winner of this war was the Qin kingdom. The White Emperor obtained more than half of the territory of the Chu kingdom, but the most fertile eastern wilderness and the most important west camp fell into the hands of Zhao. When the news of the fire in the imperial palace of the Chu kingdom reached the west camp, He Zhan was in front of a map in the central military tent, discussing with the generals of Zhao how useful the old straight road in the western mountain would be if they were to invade Xianyang in the future. After hearing the news, he was silent for a while and then waved his hand to signal the generals to leave. Then he came to the room behind the tent. "Your emperor is dead," he said to the eunuch and the prostitute. The prostitute was somewhat at a loss and did not know what to say. The eunuch, on the other hand, burst into tears. He was a poor child who had a hard life and was often bullied in the imperial palace. If he had not shouted when someone wanted to burn down the imperial palace that year and won the trust of His Majesty, he would not have had the chance to live so many years of good life. "It seems that your emperor liked you very much. Before he died, he wanted to find a way for you to live and sent you to me." He Zhan looked at them and said, "I wanted to kill you to disappoint him, but you are a gift after all, and I have never had the habit of refusing gifts." In all of Zhao, including the Qi kingdom, there were countless people who wanted to give gifts to Elder He, but only Jingzhou dared to give him a gift by force. Accepting a gift did not mean that he would use it. For He Zhan, it was not difficult to deal with it. He planned to ask his subordinates to send the eunuch and the prostitute to the Qi kingdom, and then ask the Shang of Qi to send them to the sea, where they could find a small island and live out their lives happily. What he didn't like was why Jingzhou had never contacted him in the past, and why he didn't surrender to Zhao state but to Qin state instead of Zhao state. What was the point of surrendering to Qin state? "I am not familiar with you, but Shenma Peak and Guoqing Temple have a good relationship, which should be better than the relationship with Zhongzhou School, right?" With such doubts, He Zhan returned to the capital of Zhao. On the long street, the fleet of carriages was welcomed by the people, which was rare. The tiki beside the carriages had a strange look on their faces, wondering what was going on. Expanding the territory was undoubtedly the greatest achievement. No matter how much they hated him, they could only remain silent at this time. He Zhan did not feel anything, nor did he care. The cheers outside the window were no different from the screams of the officials in the intelligence bureau to him. He was still thinking about that matter. As he walked into the imperial study, the young emperor came up to him and said sincerely, "Thank you for your hard work, uncle." He Zhan suddenly said, "I have figured it out." The emperor's expression changed slightly, but he forced himself to remain calm and said, "Uncle, what have you figured out?" He Zhan ignored him and said, "So it is because of the ill-fated princess." The emperor found it more and more strange, but it was not appropriate for him to ask further. He Zhan collected his thoughts and came to the bookshelf in the imperial study. He pulled open the curtain and revealed the huge map behind it. Looking at the map, he was silent for a moment, and then he picked up his pen and marked a place in the Zhao territory. There were many such marks on the map, but there were still more blank spaces waiting in silence. "It is said that I won the Battle of the West military camp because I was far-sighted and didn't do anything. But nobody knew that this was the plan that the former emperor and I had drawn up 15 years ago." He Zhan continued while looking at the young emperor, "You should plan before you take any action. You should think it through before you do anything." The young emperor remained silent, as he thought that since it was the late emperor's effort, he was not qualified to lecture him. "I don't know if the Chu emperor set himself on fire, or if he was killed by the imperial officials, or if he escaped with the help of the fire." He Jean came before the table and poured himself a cup of tea. He continued, "Regardless of whether he is dead or not, he is dead as far as the Chu people are concerned. He won't be able to cause any more trouble." The young emperor was startled upon hearing this, thinking that these words were a warning to him. He didn't dare remain silent any longer, saying, "I understand, uncle." It had been 37 years since the participants of the Tao competition had entered the world of the green sky mirror. Flowers couldn't bloom for 100 days, and people couldn't be happy for 1,000 days. Moreover, the relationship between the young emperor and elder, he had never been good. The peaceful situation of the Zhao state didn't last long. As time went by, the emperor was getting closer and closer to adulthood, and he was about to take charge of the state. Naturally, many officials would express their loyalty in advance. The young emperor was getting more and more confident. He was still filial to the Empress Dowager and respectful to Hejan, but he would inevitably have some other ideas. A newly promoted Jinshi submitted a memorial to the imperial court, saying that the Zhao state governed the world with filial piety. As the emperor's father, King Hejian should be honored as the emperor, and his memorial tablet should be placed in the imperial ancestral temple. There was an uproar in the court, but none of the officials dared to express their opinions. The emperor remained silent, and the bead curtain remained motionless. Normally, this matter would cause a great disturbance, and the two sides would attack each other like a storm, but the court and the public remained strangely quiet. Everyone knew what the reason was. In the late autumn, the carriage of elder, he was stopped by a brave scholar. The scholar ignored the cold and gloomy eyes of the tiki and the worried eyes of the people around him, and shouted, "This is a great gift of the state. Please tell me, eunuch." No one thought that elder he would answer this question, although everyone knew his opinion. Once this kind of question was answered, it was equal to opening the lid of the furnace, which could easily cause a big fire. The best way was to ignore it and pretend not to hear it. No one thought that everyone on the street heard his voice. "King Hejian is a commandery prince. How can he be qualified to enter the imperial ancestral temple?" The scholar was very surprised, and then his face showed a look of ecstasy, and he shouted repeatedly, "But he is the emperor's father." The voice of elder, he was still so calm. The emperor was adopted by the late emperor, so he has no father and son relationship with King Hejian. The scholar felt more and more that he would become famous today. His face turned red as if he had drunk a lot of wine, and he shouted, "Eunuch, you are an abnormal person, and you don't know the Tao of human relations. How can you be qualified to judge this matter?" The street became extremely quiet. Everyone thought that the scholar would die on the spot, or be arrested, and then be executed by 1,000 cuts. The tiki and the highly skilled eunuchs looked at the scholar as if they were looking at a dead man. Something unexpected happened again. Elder, he didn't say anything. He ordered the carriage to move on, and he didn't pay attention to the scholar at all. Seeing the tiki leaving, the scholar couldn't stand it anymore, and his legs became weak. If he hadn't been surrounded by the crowd, he would have fallen to the ground. Hearing the praises coming from around and seeing the admiring expressions on people's faces, the scholar was very proud. He forced himself to calm down, and then he cupped his hands to salute, and said some powerful words. A middle-aged scholar stood outside the crowd, shook his head at the scene, and left with a few people who looked like students. That day they stayed in an academy. After finishing their homework, the students couldn't help but talk about what happened during the day. They all said that they were lucky to see such a scene when they just arrived in the capital of Zhao. The discussion turned into a discussion, and eventually into a debate. The students argued more and more fiercely, and in the end, they could only look at the middle-aged scholar for help. The middle-aged scholar was elegant, and he looked calm. He was Mr. Yun-Chi, who was highly respected by the world. The students wanted to know his answer, and the world also wanted to know. Chapter 401. Yun-Chi said, "I support eunuch he." Hearing this answer, the students from the Academy of the Qi Kingdom were very surprised. What they wanted to ask was the teacher's judgment on Zhao's situation in the imperial court, not who he supported. In their opinion, the latter answer was yes. He Zhan controlled the imperial court of Zhao and humiliated the emperor. Most importantly, he was a eunuch. His reputation was far worse than that of the ruthless White Emperor. Who would support him? Although surprised, the students listened carefully because they believed that the teacher must have a reason. Last year, the Chu Emperor had been praised by the teacher before he burned down the palace and died for his country. Who could understand it at that time? King Hejian is a commandery prince. He is not qualified to enter the imperial ancestral temple. Yun-Chi's explanation was exactly the same as what He Zhan said on the long street today. A student said, "But he is Zhao Huang's biological father after all. It's normal for father and son to be unforgettable. The problem is that if the emperor insisted that King Hejian was his father, he shouldn't have come to the capital." Yun-Chi said, "The previous Zhao Huang was generous and open-minded. How could he blame you just because he didn't want to be the emperor? It's just that the people of Hejian Manor didn't want to." After hearing this, the students thought carefully and found that it was indeed reasonable. No matter whether you regard the traitor as your father or the emperor as your father, as long as you do, you have to accept it. Yun-Chi took a sip of tea and found that some students seemed to have thought of another explanation and were about to speak. He smiled and said, "Of course, as people grow up, their views on everything may change. But you can also regret it. You can just abdicate and go back to Hejian Manor to be an idle lord. It's not a difficult life. The problem is that he still doesn't want to." The student's face revealed an understanding expression, and he didn't say anything else. Back then, it was Hejian Manor who didn't want to. Now it's the emperor himself who doesn't want to. He doesn't want to give up this and that. He wants to take advantage of both sides. Yun-Chi said with a smile, "How could a figure like eunuch he allow others to take advantage of him? We'll set off tomorrow." Since he would not allow it, Zhao would immediately welcome a bloody storm. The scholar did not have the strength to truss a chicken, so it was better for him to stay far away. The next morning, Yun-Chi left the capital of the state of Zhao with his students, preparing to go to the Chu kingdom to see the palace that had been burned to ruins. Apart from the secret agents of the Intelligence Bureau, few people knew that the great scholar of the Qi Kingdom's education palace had been here before, let alone his comments. The conversation between He Zhan and that scholar on the long street had spread throughout the whole capital as quickly as possible, and then to the more distant counties and states. When the scholar returned home and calmed down, he naturally felt some fear. But he believed in his political judgment and felt that there should be no problem. The more serious the matter was, the more cautious the bigwigs in the imperial court would be. With this thought and hope for a bright future, he drank a pot of good wine and passed out in a drunken stupor. Then, he died just like that. Not long after the early morning, a few of his classmates heard about what had happened the day before and came to congratulate him with 2 old hens in their hands. As they pushed open the door and entered the small courtyard, they saw the ground covered in red and the corpse that had been so deformed that it was unrecognizable. Screams and screams broke the silence in the surroundings. Dozens of arresters, government runners, and coroners surrounded the small courtyard, but the scene inside was soon spread out. It was said that the scholar had died a very miserable death. It was obvious that he had been tortured to death. There was not a piece of undamaged skin on his body, and not a single bone was intact. It was unknown how much he had suffered when he was alive. The more tragic the death, the more likely it was to arouse the public's anger. Moreover, there were many forces behind the scenes who added fuel to the fire. Soon, the incident caused a great disturbance. The students of the Imperial College and many people surrounded the Intelligence Bureau angrily. The gloomy government office did not look so scary in the raging crowd. The angry people smashed the door of the Intelligence Bureau and rushed in, only to find that it was empty inside. There were no officials or eunuchs. All kinds of files and valuables had been moved away in advance. Even the gold-rimmed toilet bowl in the famous latrine was no longer in its original position. The government runners responsible for maintaining the security of the capital didn't dare to show up. The cavalrymen of the Imperial Army guarded the periphery. The soldiers of the City Gate Department stood further away, watching the bustle over there. They had no intention of taking action. The tide ebbed and flowed again. The crowd gradually dispersed, leaving only the Intelligence Bureau in a mess. Many officials in various mansions in the capital were discussing the incident and discussing something. Many officials thought that he had handled the incident unwisely and that his response was too weak. He was like an old lion, not worth to be feared. However, he had been in power for many years and had accumulated a great deal of power. Most of the officials didn't dare to act rashly. They wanted to wait and see how the situation would develop. It didn't take long for He-Jean to make a move that night. The tiki galloped through the streets and alleys of the capital. The thunderous hoofbeats made people's hearts palpitate. Dozens of highly skilled eunuchs pushed open the doors of mansions, one after another, with He-Jean's handwritten letter in their hands. Under the commander of the Imperial Army, a total of 14 high-ranking officers were imprisoned and 7 officials of the City Gate Department were arrested. 2 of them were killed on the spot for resisting. The next morning, the governor of the capital resigned, the Imperial College was closed, and 79 students involved in the incident were arrested. The young emperor was nowhere to be seen at the court meeting, and there was no one behind the bead curtain. He, who seldom attended court meetings, stood in the front of the hall from the shadows. He looked at the officials and calmly said, "I can understand if you want me to die, but before you kill me, I hope you will know your place." They had read the books of sages and eaten the food of the royal family. Not all of the officials could endure this kind of humiliation. They stood out on the spot to denounce the wrongdoings. Those officials were carried out of the palace by the guards to be publicly flogged. Not long after, one of them was beaten to death. The situation had become serious. All of the officials left the hall in anger. They came to the front of the royal palace and knelt down. Their cries shook the heavens as they talked about how the previous emperor was in the royal study. The young emperor looked at He-Jean with a pale face. There was fear and even more hatred in his eyes. In a low voice, he said, "Crying in the palace will be recorded in the history books." He-Jean's expression was indifferent. "Do you think I care?" His name would inevitably be recorded in the annals of history, and he would go down in infamy for thousands of years as a powerful eunuch. The young emperor forced himself to calm down and said, "Even if I did something wrong, those officials and students are innocent. Please have mercy." He-Jean said, "It's very simple to release them. Your Majesty only needs to go out and say a word." As for what he wanted to say, everyone knew very well. The young emperor stared into his eyes and said, "That is my father." He-Jean said, "I don't think so." The young emperor was so angry that he said in a trembling voice, "I am still an emperor. Why do you have to force me to this extent?" He-Jean looked at him in silence and said nothing. But the young emperor understood what he meant. His body was slightly cold. He gritted his teeth and said, "Mother will not allow you to act recklessly." At this moment, a eunuch nervously said outside the royal study, "Eunuch, the Empress Dowager invites you." Hearing this, the young emperor finally relaxed. He-Jean narrowed his eyes and looked at him. It's quite easy to call her mother. Having said this, he turned and left the royal study for the Yuan Palace. The Empress Dowager had been in charge of the palace for many years. She still had her charm and majesty, so she treated He-Jean differently. She advised him gently, "It's hard for a child to miss his father. Even though it's not in line with the system and unreasonable, it's fine if you reprimanded him, but there's no need to make such a big fuss. And the matter of the scholar, it's too much." He-Jean didn't explain the matter of the scholar. He said, "I told His Majesty years ago that the Hejin Prefecture is a bunch of untamed bastards." Hearing the word, His Majesty, the Empress Dowager's expression became cold. "I think this child is not bad. Don't act recklessly." She stared into He-Jean's eyes, wanting some kind of guarantee. He-Jean said, "I won't do anything, but those disobedient officials can't be kept. Please, Your Majesty, issue an edict to expel them from the court." The Empress Dowager was very angry. "Who in the court is willing to listen to you? Are you going to expel or kill them all?" The conversation ended in discord, and the matter reached an impasse, unless He-Jean purged all the officials in the court. However, as the Empress Dowager was worried about who would rule the country if all the officials were killed or expelled, it was at that moment that Yun-Chi returned from the Chu kingdom. He revealed his identity and requested to see Elder He. As the leader of the education palace of the Qi kingdom, he had traveled around the world and given lectures for 20 years. He had an irreplaceable position in the hearts of the scholars and an unattainable reputation. Many people thought that the reason why a figure like Master Yun-Chi requested to see the notorious eunuch, he must be because of the recent event. He-Jean met Yun-Chi in the intelligence bureau. The yamen was very clean, so the traces of the smashing that day were even more obvious. He-Jean looked at Yun-Chi and asked calmly, "Do you think it's all my fault?" Yun-Chi said, "You were right in the beginning, but you were wrong in the end." He-Jean said, "This is the place where I made my fortune, but it was smashed just like that." Yun-Chi said, "If the eunuch didn't want this place to be smashed, who could have smashed it? Since Zhao is the eunuch's, you should cherish it more." He-Jean sighed, "You really haven't become that kind of rotten scholar." Yun-Chi looked at him in silence and asked, "Do you know me?" He-Jean said with a smile, "I heard that you have forgotten everything, and it seems to be the case." Yun-Chi stopped thinking about it and said with a carefree expression, "Since I don't remember those things, I can't say that I've forgotten them." He-Jean said, "What you said is reasonable. Anyway, thank you for coming." He was grateful to Yun-Chi for giving him a way out so that the whole thing could move on to the next stage as soon as possible. As for the students and officials of the Imperial College who had been released, they were even more grateful to Master Yun-Chi. After this incident, Master Yun-Chi's reputation grew even higher, as if he had become a mountain. Of course, He-Jean didn't care. Just when everyone thought that the matter would come to an end, that Elder He had finally revealed his weakness and that the Imperial Party could take another step forward, the young emperor had been poisoned. The poison was not very strong, not as strong as liquor, and not as sharp as a knife. The poison slowly circulated in his body, bringing no pain, only weakness and a sense of bewilderment. It was not until this moment that he realized that all his years of preparation had been meaningless. Those favors, those methods, and those eunuchs and guards who had been subdued were all fake. Just like his short few years as an emperor, it was like a strange black and white dream. Everything he had done was permitted by He-Jean, including torturing and killing that scholar. He-Jean sat on a round stool in front of the couch and said calmly to him, "I don't care how cruel your methods are, how insidious your thoughts are, and I don't care that you tormented and killed that scholar and framed me, because this is what I wanted to teach you. It's just that I don't want to see you sitting on the throne anymore." The young emperor showed a mocking expression in his eyes as he asked, "Did you want to see it before? You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories."